The courtroom was filled with the typical hum of chatter and the rustling of papers. Lawyers exchanged last-minute notes, and a few spectators idly flipped through their phones, hoping for a quick resolution. The case at hand wasn't one that was likely to grab headlines, yet the air in the room was thick with tension. Everyone, even the most seasoned legal professionals, had a gut feeling something unusual was about to happen. And then Clint Eastwood entered. He strode into the courtroom with the same quiet authority that had made him a household name. Even now, in his mid-80s, Clint still carried himself like the iconic figure he was, a man who had faced down villains, conquered Wild West landscapes, and lived through 1,000 cinematic battles. His reputation had transcended Hollywood, but today, he wasn't here as the legendary actor. Today, he was here to address a situation that had taken an unexpected turn. As Clint made his way to his seat, whispers rippled through the room. A celebrity sighting was one thing, but Clint Eastwood in a courtroom was something entirely different. He wasn't just some washed-up former star making a last-minute cameo in the legal drama of the century. No, Clint Eastwood was someone whose name carried weight, a symbol of power and authority. The people in the room were aware of that. The press, who were eagerly snapping photos, seemed to sense it as well. This wasn't just about the case. It was about the man himself. Judge Stevens, an older, sharp-tongued figure known for his no-nonsense demeanor, peered over his glasses from the bench. His gaze flickered toward Clint, and then, with a sneer, he addressed the room. Well, well, well. Look what we have here. Mr. Eastwood, the legendary actor, gracing us with his presence. I suppose next, we'll have John Wayne walk in and take a seat, he quipped, earning a few nervous chuckles from the audience. Clint didn't flinch. He remained seated, his expression stoic as always. To those who didn't know him well, his silence might have seemed cold, aloof even. But those who were familiar with his career, his true, hidden career, knew better. Clint Eastwood had faced down tougher opponents than a judge with a penchant for sarcasm. The courtroom could throw all the jabs it wanted, but Clint wasn't one to react impulsively. Judge Stevens wasn't finished. It's hard to believe that a man of your age, Mr. Eastwood, still has the energy to show up in a courtroom like this. Maybe you're here to direct a movie? A little role reversal. Huh? You playing the hero now? The judge's voice was laced with condescension. He'd had his share of famous faces walk through his courtroom doors, but none of them had been Clint Eastwood. It was clear from his tone that he was using the actor's presence as an opportunity to display his own brand of wit. But Clint wasn't here for jokes.
Before anyone could respond, there was a sudden shift in the atmosphere. Clint's hand moved slowly, deliberately, beneath the table. He reached inside his coat pocket and pulled out a small badge, holding it up for all to see. There was an audible gasp throughout the room. The badge wasn't just any badge. It was from the United States Secret Service. A few seconds passed in stunned silence. Judge Stevens blinked, his mocking grin faltering slightly. "Excuse me," he finally asked, his voice now tinged with confusion. "What is that supposed to be?" Clint didn't speak a word. He simply let the badge shine under the bright courtroom lights, the insignia clear for everyone to see. The audience, the lawyers, even the judge, everyone was frozen in shock. The press had stopped clicking their cameras. The only sounds in the room were the soft murmurs of disbelief. Judge Stevens, clearly taken aback, cleared his throat and leaned forward. He started, but Clint cut him off with a single glance. Clint's calm, unwavering eyes told the story. He wasn't here to explain himself. Not yet, at least. His silence was his power. The badge was enough. He didn't need to explain why it was there or why it mattered. It was a simple fact: Clint Eastwood wasn't just the famous actor, the Hollywood legend. He was also someone who held a position of great responsibility within the government. The judge looked at the badge, then back at Clint, his demeanor shifting. No longer was he the proud, mocking figure that had greeted Clint with a joke. Now, he was a man faced with a mystery he hadn't been prepared to solve. Clint leaned back in his chair, his face unchanged. He didn't offer an explanation. He didn't need to. The courtroom had become his stage, but this time, the performance was far from a scripted role. This was reality. What does this mean, Mr. Eastwood? Judge Stevens asked, his voice no longer filled with sarcasm. His earlier confidence had waned, replaced by a genuine curiosity, and perhaps a little bit of fear. Clint finally spoke. His voice was gravelly, low, but steady. It means, Judge Stevens, that I am not just an actor. I'm here because I have a responsibility. And it's one I take seriously. The words hung in the air, each one heavy with meaning. The courtroom, once filled with tension and mockery, now pulsed with something more serious. The media had already begun to buzz with questions, and the implications of Clint's statement were far-reaching. What was a man of Clint's stature doing here? Why was he revealing this part of his life? And more importantly, what did it mean for the case at hand? Judge Stevens, though still trying to regain his composure, finally nodded. He seemed unsure of how to proceed. His earlier bravado had evaporated. I see, he said, although it was clear he didn't. Well, let's proceed with the case, then.
But Clint's revelation wasn't just a plot twist for the courtroom. It was the start of something far larger. Something that would change the course of not only the case, but also the lives of everyone in that room. The judge might have thought he had the upper hand, but Clint's revelation of his USSS badge was the first move in a much deeper game. As the proceedings continued, the tension was palpable. Clint sat silently, but his presence had changed the dynamic in the room. What was once a mundane case had now become something much more complicated. And in the silence, the audience began to wonder, who was Clint Eastwood, really? And what had he just revealed about himself? For Clint, it was just the beginning. This opening chapter sets the stage for the mystery surrounding Clint Eastwood's unexpected role in the courtroom. The suspense builds, and the audience is left eager to know more about Clint's secret life and what consequences will follow. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The courtroom buzzed with an intensity that could almost be felt in the air. No one knew exactly what to think or how to react. Clint Eastwood, the Hollywood icon, had just revealed a secret no one could have anticipated. But Clint wasn't one to share personal details unless he had to. This moment, while monumental, was only the beginning of a much larger story. A story rooted in the past, filled with dark secrets, unexpected choices, and a commitment to something greater than fame. Clint leaned back in his chair, his arms folded across his chest. The buzz around him continued, but he remained silent, his piercing eyes fixed straight ahead. The events of the courtroom were like a blur to him, as though he were watching them unfold from a distance, separate from the chaos he had once faced on screen. This wasn't a movie. There were no scripted lines or dramatic slow-motion shots. This was real life, and Clint had learned long ago to adapt to whatever came his way. But this wasn't the first time Clint had found himself stepping out of the shadows. In fact, his life had always been a careful balance between the world of Hollywood fame and the quiet, often dangerous world of government work. It all started years ago, when Clint was at the height of his acting career. He had played the tough, unflappable hero in countless westerns and action films. His characters had faced the most difficult odds, whether it was battling a gang of criminals or standing up to an unjust system. But in real life, Clint had never been the kind of man who sought fame or attention. He was a private person, a man who preferred solitude over the spotlight.
Clint had been working on a film set in the early 80s when he was first approached by a figure from his past, a government agent who recognized Clint's unique set of skills. Clint's instincts, honed from years of portraying gritty characters on screen, had caught the attention of someone with real power. It wasn't long before Clint was offered a position with the United States Secret Service, USSS. At first, Clint had been hesitant. He had always been a man of independence, a man who cherished his privacy. But the offer was too compelling to ignore. As a member of the Secret Service, Clint would have the chance to protect the nation's most important individuals and fight threats in a way that was much more meaningful than the roles he played in front of the camera. It was an opportunity to make a real difference. Though his decision was a carefully guarded secret, Clint took the offer. He underwent the rigorous training required to become an agent. It wasn't easy, he was already in his 50s, and the physical demands of the job were no joke. But Clint was used to hard work, and he quickly adapted to the challenges. He found himself in situations that tested his resolve in ways that no film ever could. There were no rehearsals, no second takes. The stakes were high, and the risks were real. Over the years, Clint found himself balancing his two worlds, the bright lights of Hollywood and the shadowy world of government protection. He was still making films, movies that cemented his place in American culture, but his nights and weekends were spent training with the Secret Service, working covert operations, and providing protection to high-profile individuals. No one outside of a select few knew the truth. To the public, Clint was the iconic actor, the man who could never be touched by the ravages of time. But behind closed doors, he was something more, a man whose life was lived in secrecy, protecting the very people he had portrayed in fictionalized danger for decades. It wasn't an easy life. Clint couldn't tell his family, his friends, or even his closest colleagues about his secret life. He had to keep his two worlds separate, something that was often difficult to do. But over time, he became used to it. The sacrifices were worth it for the sense of purpose he found in protecting those who needed it most. As Clint sat in the courtroom now, his mind briefly wandered back to those early days. He remembered the first time he had been involved in a real operation, the adrenaline of tracking down a threat that could have endangered the lives of innocent people. He recalled how his acting experience helped him stay calm under pressure, how playing a hero in countless films had conditioned him to think quickly and act decisively when it mattered most.
His thoughts were interrupted when the courtroom began to settle. He looked around, seeing the faces of the people who had gathered to witness something far beyond their expectations. No one could have known the weight of Clint's decision to join the Secret Service, or how long he had kept it hidden. But now, everything was changing. Across the room, Judge Stevens was still processing what had just happened. The judge, who had spent most of his career with an air of superiority and control, now found himself confronted by a man who had lived a life of far greater consequence. Clint Eastwood wasn't just a Hollywood legend. He was a protector of the nation's highest officials, a man who had kept secrets for decades. And now, the courtroom had become the setting for something far bigger than a legal case. Judge Stevens cleared his throat and glanced down at his notes. He had regained his composure, but it was clear that this wasn't just another routine day in court. "Mr. Eastwood," the judge began, his voice now calm but still carrying an undertone of disbelief, "I must admit, I wasn't expecting this. Your dual life has certainly taken us all by surprise." Clint remained silent, his face expressionless. He wasn't here to explain himself, at least not yet. His role was clear. There was a case to be decided, and he wasn't going to let his personal revelations get in the way of justice. Judge Stevens continued, "I would be lying if I said this doesn't change things. But I also need to understand why you're here, and what this all means for the case at hand. This is more than just a celebrity moment. We have real legal matters to address." Clint leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing as he met the judge's gaze. "The case is important," Clint said, his voice low but firm. "But so is what I'm here to protect. There are bigger things at play than what you might think." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Clint's revelation had already started to shift the dynamics of the case, and it was clear that Judge Stevens, along with everyone else in the room, would have to reassess their understanding of Clint Eastwood. What had started as an ordinary court proceeding had suddenly turned into something much more complex. Clint wasn't just a witness or a celebrity. He was a man who had seen things, lived through things, and now, his world was about to collide with the legal system in ways no one could have anticipated. And for Clint, the real challenge was only just beginning. The room was thick with unease as the ripple effect of Clint Eastwood's revelation continued to play out. The once casual proceedings had turned into something much more profound. Every eye in the courtroom was trained on Clint now, and even the judge, who had made light of his presence just moments ago, seemed to be at a loss for how to proceed. Clint's past, hidden for so long, was now laid bare for the world to see, and with it, A cascade of questions followed.
Clint's hand rested lightly on the table, the USSS badge still visible to those close enough to notice. It wasn't just a piece of metal, it was a symbol. A symbol of power, secrecy, and untold stories that he had carried with him for decades. What had begun as a joke, a moment of ridicule, had now transformed into something that made everyone in the courtroom, every person watching from behind screens, realize that they were dealing with more than just an aging actor. The press in the back row, who had initially been snapping pictures of the star for gossip columns, were now paying full attention, their pens scribbling furiously as they tried to piece together the meaning of Clint's unexpected role in the case. Who would have guessed that Clint Eastwood, the man who had once commanded the screen with his steely gaze and unflinching determination, had spent decades behind the scenes as an agent of the United States Secret Service? As the minutes stretched on, Clint maintained his composure. The silence in the room weighed heavily on him, but he wasn't one to break under pressure. His time in the Secret Service had taught him how to stay calm when everything around him seemed to be falling apart. But even he couldn't shake the growing sense that this was not just another mission. There was something bigger unfolding here, something he wasn't yet prepared for. Judge Stevens, still grappling with the gravity of the situation, cleared his throat again. His voice, when it came, was more measured, but still thick with the air of confusion. "Mr. Eastwood," he began, his tone less mocking than before, "I need to know what your involvement is in this case. You've revealed a great deal about your past, but you haven't explained how this pertains to the proceedings today." Clint looked up, meeting the judge's gaze with a sharpness that belied his age. "It pertains more than you think," he replied coolly. His voice had that unmistakable authority, the kind that didn't demand attention but naturally commanded it. He was a man who had made a living out of being unflappable, and right now, his calm demeanor was a reflection of a deeper, unspoken truth. The judge shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his fingers drumming lightly on his desk. "Can you be more specific? The court needs to understand your position in all of this." Clint exhaled slowly. "My position is that of an investigator. An agent, if you will. I'm here because this case, while seemingly straightforward, is far from that. There are forces at play, forces you have no idea are lurking beneath the surface." A murmur ran through the room, the spectators exchanging looks of disbelief. An investigator? The Clint Eastwood? It seemed impossible, yet the presence of the badge on the table spoke volumes. It wasn't a prop. It wasn't part of a script. This was real, and Clint was more than just the man who played the hero.
The courtroom was on edge, hanging on every word. Clint knew that whatever he said next would either clarify or complicate the situation even further. He wasn't here by accident. There was a reason he had been drawn into this case. He paused, letting the tension linger. "There's a threat, Judge. One that could unravel everything you think you know about this case. This isn't just about legalities. This is bigger than that." The judge leaned forward, his interest piqued. "A threat? What kind of threat?" Clint's eyes narrowed slightly. "A threat that comes from within. The kind of threat that hides in the shadows, disguised as something harmless. A threat that, if left unchecked, could destroy everything we hold dear. And it's tied to this very courtroom." The atmosphere shifted again, the weight of Clint's words sinking into the minds of everyone present. People had entered this courtroom expecting a typical legal drama, the kind that played out in mundane cases every day. But now they were faced with something much more complex. And it wasn't just Clint's presence that made the difference. It was the underlying implication of his words. This case was not a simple legal battle. It was a puzzle with pieces no one had seen coming. Judge Stevens, though still skeptical, was beginning to understand the gravity of the situation. "Are you suggesting that this case, which was supposed to be about a civil dispute, is somehow tied to a larger national security issue?" he asked, his voice a mixture of disbelief and curiosity. Clint nodded. "Exactly. And the sooner you accept that, the better we'll all be." The judge stared at him for a long moment, trying to process the enormity of what Clint had just said. But before he could respond, a sudden shift in the room occurred. The doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, and in walked a man who no one had expected. He was tall, with sharp features and an air of authority that immediately commanded attention. His suit was impeccably tailored, and his expression was grim. Without a word, he walked toward the judge's bench, his eyes scanning the room as he did. The crowd fell silent. Even Clint's steady gaze faltered slightly as he observed the man's approach. There was something familiar about him, a sense of danger that Clint couldn't quite place. The man reached the front of the courtroom and, without asking for permission, addressed the judge directly. "Judge Stevens, we need to talk." "In private," the man said, his voice low but urgent. The judge looked taken aback. "Who are you, and what is this about?" The man didn't flinch. "I'm Agent Pierce, Department of Homeland Security, and this is no longer just a civil case. We have reason to believe that national security is at risk."
The air in the room grew colder, and the tension that had been building throughout the day reached its peak. It was no longer just a case. It was now something much bigger, something that would change the lives of everyone involved, and Clint Eastwood was right at the center of it. Clint watched the newcomer carefully, his instincts flaring. Homeland Security? National security at risk? This was escalating far faster than he'd anticipated. There was a new player in the game, and Clint knew all too well that when someone from Homeland Security stepped in, the stakes had just been raised to an entirely new level. The courtroom, once filled with idle curiosity, now held an air of impending danger. What had started as a simple court case was rapidly becoming something far more dangerous, and Clint Eastwood had just been thrust into a situation where the line between his past and present was blurring. And with every passing second, the shadows grew closer. The room seemed to hold its breath as Agent Pierce made his way toward the judge. Clint Eastwood could feel the atmosphere shift, the stakes rising higher with each passing second. The mention of Homeland Security had sent a jolt of recognition through him. Something big was at play, something that tied back to the covert operations Clint had once been involved in. His mind, honed by years of navigating danger, was already racing with possibilities, trying to piece together the puzzle that was unfolding. Agent Pierce stood at the front of the courtroom, his dark eyes scanning the faces of everyone in the room. Clint could see the cold professionalism in his gaze, the kind of look Clint himself had learned to adopt during his time as a Secret Service agent. But there was something else there too, an urgency, a flicker of concern that made Clint uneasy. Judge Stevens looked between Clint and Agent Pierce, clearly confused and unsure of what to do next. "Agent Pierce, what is this all about?" the judge finally asked, his voice shaky but authoritative. "This is a courtroom, not a security briefing." Agent Pierce turned to face the judge, his expression hardening. "With all due respect, Judge Stevens, this is no longer just a legal matter. We've just learned that the defendant in this case, Mr. Clayton Harris, has ties to a larger network of operatives involved in national security threats. This case goes far beyond the scope of a civil dispute. We're dealing with espionage, black market weapons, and covert operations that could undermine everything we're working to protect." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. The defendant, Clayton Harris, had been sitting quietly up until now, but at the mention of his name, his eyes flickered nervously. He was a well-dressed businessman, but there was something about his demeanor that made Clint suspicious. Was Harris involved in a deeper conspiracy than anyone realized?
Clint's mind began to churn. He had been part of operations where the stakes were high, where the line between life and death was blurred. But this was something else entirely. The notion that a seemingly innocent civil dispute was a front for something so dangerous was unsettling. And yet, given the nature of the case, Clint knew that anything was possible. "Espionage?" Judge Stevens echoed, incredulous. "Are you saying this entire case is a front for something much darker?" "Yes," Agent Pierce confirmed. "And I believe Mr. Eastwood knows more than he's letting on. His involvement here is not coincidental." The courtroom fell into silence once again, all eyes turning to Clint. He could feel the weight of the room's gaze on him, but he remained still, his face a mask of stoic calm. The truth was, Clint had known something wasn't right from the start. The subtle hints that had been dropped about Harris, the strange behavior of the lawyers, the way the legal proceedings had seemed off-kilter, all pointed to something far more sinister. But Clint had remained silent, watching, waiting for the right moment to act. That moment had arrived, and now he was being thrust into the heart of the storm. Judge Stevens looked at Clint, his expression now filled with a mix of uncertainty and expectation. "Mr. Eastwood, do you have something to share with us? What is your connection to this case, and what do you know about the threats Agent Pierce is referring to?" Clint stood slowly, his movements deliberate. The courtroom held its breath, awaiting his response. He knew that this was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment where everything changed. But even as he began to speak, Clint couldn't shake the feeling that his own past was catching up with him. The shadows that had always lurked in the corners of his life were now stepping into the light. "I'm here because I've been tracking Harris for months," Clint said, his voice low but steady. "I didn't want to be involved. I was only supposed to observe, to keep an eye on things from a distance. But after what I saw in this courtroom, after everything that's been happening behind the scenes, I realized I couldn't stay in the shadows anymore. The stakes are too high." The room was completely silent as Clint spoke. His words were heavy, each one carrying the weight of years of experience and knowledge. He wasn't just an actor anymore. He wasn't just a celebrity. He was Clint Eastwood, the man who had seen the worst of the world and had done everything in his power to protect it. "Clayton Harris is part of a much larger network," Clint continued, his gaze never wavering from the defendant. "A network that has infiltrated multiple levels of government, law enforcement, and private industry. They've been using this case as a cover for something far more dangerous. I believe they're planning a major attack, one that could destabilize the country in ways no one is prepared for."
Clint's words sent a wave of shock through the room. The people in the courtroom, from the judge to the spectators, had thought they were merely witnessing a typical legal battle. But now they realized they were witnessing the unraveling of something far more complex. Clint had just pulled back the curtain on a conspiracy that reached far beyond the case at hand. Judge Stevens looked at Clint with a mixture of disbelief and awe. "Are you telling me this man," he said, pointing at Harris, "is part of some kind of terrorist network?" Clint nodded. "It's not just him. Harris is merely a pawn in a much larger game. There are people, powerful people, behind him. People who are pulling the strings, manipulating the system. And if we don't stop them now, it could be too late." The room was electric with tension as Clint's words sank in. The courtroom, once filled with mundane legal proceedings, had become the epicenter of a national security crisis. The implications of what Clint was saying were enormous. The man they had all thought was a harmless defendant was now revealed to be part of a larger conspiracy, one that threatened the very fabric of the country. Agent Pierce stepped forward, his face grim. "Mr. Eastwood is right. And we believe that Harris is just one piece of a much larger operation. We've been tracking his movements for months, but until now, we didn't have enough evidence to bring him in. But this case, this trial, it has given us the opening we needed. We're going to need all hands on deck to stop what's coming." Clint's eyes flickered with resolve. "Then let's not waste any more time. The longer we wait, the more dangerous this becomes." The judge, still processing the gravity of the situation, nodded slowly. "I understand. This court will be adjourned for now, but I expect full cooperation from everyone involved. We need to get to the bottom of this, and fast." As the proceedings came to a halt, Clint could feel the weight of what was happening. The world he had once carefully kept separate from his Hollywood persona had collided with his present reality, and there was no turning back. The threat was real, and the stakes had never been higher. Clint stood in the middle of the courtroom, the eyes of everyone on him, and for the first time in a long while, he felt the familiar stirrings of tension, the kind that only came when danger was close. The shadows that had once been distant were now upon him, and the only way out was to confront them head-on.
The courtroom doors slammed shut as everyone inside seemed to breathe a collective sigh of disbelief. The moment that had just transpired wasn't supposed to happen. What started as a mundane civil case had rapidly spiraled into an investigation of national security proportions. Clint Eastwood stood at the heart of it, and the room felt like it was spinning around him. The judge banged his gavel, silencing the crowd, but the murmurs and whispers never fully stopped. No one could believe what they had just heard. Clint Eastwood, the legendary actor, had just exposed a conspiracy that reached deep into government and industry, and Clayton Harris, the unassuming defendant, was at the center of it all. Clint could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The Secret Service badge that had been revealed in the courtroom was not just a piece of his past. It was a doorway into something much larger, something that Clint hadn't fully anticipated. For years, he had been able to keep his two worlds separate, the world of Hollywood fame and the covert operations he had carried out in the shadows. But now, those worlds were colliding, and he had no choice but to confront it head-on. As the courtroom emptied, Clint was approached by Agent Pierce, who looked like he hadn't slept in days. The man's normally calm and collected demeanor had shifted, replaced by a palpable sense of urgency. "Mr. Eastwood," Pierce said, his voice low and serious, "we need to talk. Now." Clint nodded, his instincts telling him that things were only going to get more complicated. The court proceedings had been temporarily adjourned, but there was no time to waste. The moment had passed, but the danger hadn't. They walked through the narrow corridors of the courthouse, the echo of their footsteps ringing in the silent hallways. Clint could feel the tension in the air, the sense that they were being watched, and he wasn't wrong. There were eyes everywhere, agents from Homeland Security, FBI personnel, and even shadowy figures that Clint couldn't quite place. "Where are we headed?" Clint asked, his voice breaking the silence. Pierce didn't answer immediately, his gaze fixed straight ahead as they moved quickly. They passed through a secured door and into a small, dimly lit room. A large table dominated the space, with papers, documents, and several files scattered across it. Clint didn't need to be told. He could already sense the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just a debriefing. This was a war room. Pierce motioned for Clint to sit, and Clint did so without hesitation. He'd been in situations like this before. Situations where time was a luxury they couldn't afford. As Clint settled into the chair, Pierce closed the door behind him and stood at the table, sorting through the files. Finally, he spoke.
"Mr. Eastwood, everything you said in the courtroom was correct," Pierce began, his voice even but strained. "Clayton Harris is a key player in a much larger network of operatives. We've been tracking him for months, but until now, we didn't have enough evidence to make a move. This case, it was our opening, but now things have gotten much more dangerous." Clint sat up straighter. "Dangerous how? What's really going on here?" Pierce turned to face him, a hard look in his eyes. "You mentioned espionage. You were right. Harris is connected to an international network that has been operating under the radar for years. They've infiltrated key positions in both private and government sectors. We're talking about sabotage, cyber attacks, illegal arms deals, and covert operations that could destabilize entire countries." Clint leaned forward, absorbing every word. "So, this isn't just about a civil case anymore. It's bigger than that, way bigger." "Exactly," Pierce confirmed. "And the most troubling part is that we've just scratched the surface. We've been unable to get close to Harris until now, but the trial gave us the perfect chance to make a move. And now, with the attention on him, we believe the real threat is just beginning." Clint rubbed his chin, deep in thought. "And you think Harris is just one part of a larger scheme?" "Yes," Pierce said, his voice grim. "He's a key player, but there are others we've identified but haven't been able to connect directly. The network spans across continents, from Europe to Asia, and its reach is deep within several industries. They've been operating like a well-oiled machine, staying under the radar while pulling the strings of major world events." Clint's mind raced, trying to process everything Pierce had just revealed. He'd known the stakes were high, but he hadn't realized how deep the conspiracy went. His past, once something he had put behind him, was pulling him back into a world of danger he hadn't signed up for. But now, Clint realized, there was no turning back. He had to see this through. "How do we take them down?" Clint asked, his voice calm but resolute. Pierce hesitated for a moment before answering. "We need to get to Harris. We need to break him, make him talk. But it's not going to be easy. He's connected to people in power, people who are pulling the strings behind the scenes. And we have reason to believe that he's just a small part of something far more dangerous. We need to work quickly, but carefully. Clint nodded slowly. I can help with that. I've been tracking Harris for a while now. I know his habits, his routines. We can use that to our advantage.
Pierce raised an eyebrow. How exactly? Clint's eyes glinted with the sharpness of someone who had lived in the shadows for years. I've got a few connections. People who can help us get close to him. People who can make sure we're not walking into a trap. And I know how to move through these circles without attracting attention. If we want to get to Harris, we need to be smarter than he is. Pierce looked impressed, though his expression remained serious. That's exactly what we need. But we're not just dealing with Harris. This whole operation is larger than we thought, and it's going to take everything we've got to bring it down. Clint's mind was already moving forward. He could feel the adrenaline surging through him, the old instincts coming alive. This wasn't just about protecting his country anymore. This was personal. His past as a Secret Service agent wasn't something he could leave behind. Not now. He had unfinished business. Let's get started, Clint said, his voice steady. We're not leaving any stones unturned. Pierce nodded in agreement, but Clint could see the flicker of doubt in his eyes. The road ahead was uncertain, and the danger was palpable. But Clint was ready. The moment of reckoning had arrived, and he would face it head-on, no matter the cost. Outside the room, the storm was building, the shadows closing in around them. But Clint Eastwood was no stranger to the dark. And now, as the walls of deception continued to close in, Clint knew that only one thing mattered. The truth had to come to light, and he was going to make sure of it. Clint Eastwood wasn't one to dwell on the past for too long, but as he sat in the sterile, dimly lit room with Agent Pierce, his mind couldn't help but drift back to his days as a Secret Service agent. The tension in the air, the overwhelming sense of urgency. It all felt too familiar. The weight of national security threats, the lives on the line, and the constant danger. It was a life he had left behind, or at least tried to. But as the seconds ticked by, Clint realized that his old world hadn't left him. It had simply been waiting for him to return. Now, there was no escaping it. The clock was ticking. The conspiracy was deeper than anyone could have imagined, and it was up to Clint and Pierce to uncover the truth before it was too late. Pierce stood across from Clint, flipping through a stack of documents. His expression was unreadable, but Clint could sense the anxiety brewing beneath the surface. Time was running out. We've been trying to pinpoint Harris's next move, but so far, it's been like chasing shadows, Pierce said, his voice strained. Every time we think we've got him cornered, he slips away. His network is vast, and it's obvious they're always one step ahead.
Clint leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he thought about their next move. You said it yourself, Pierce. Harris is just a pawn in a bigger game. If we can't get to him directly, we need to find a way to hit his network where it hurts. If we start pulling the threads, eventually, something will unravel. Pierce stopped flipping through the documents and looked at Clint, his eyes piercing. What do you have in mind? Clint paused, his mind running through every angle, every possible lead. He had learned long ago that the best way to uncover a conspiracy was to follow the people around it, those who didn't even realize they were being manipulated. And there was one name Clint couldn't get out of his head, Victoria Monroe. Victoria was a name that had popped up in the background of their investigation multiple times. She was a high-ranking executive in a private defense contractor, a company that had been under suspicion for several illegal dealings. She had ties to Clayton Harris, but her connections ran much deeper than that. Victoria was known to play both sides of the fence, pretending to be a loyal government contractor while secretly funneling resources to shadowy figures. Clint knew that if they could get to Victoria, they might be able to uncover the entire network. But getting close to her wouldn't be easy. She was as elusive as they came, and Clint knew that anyone who crossed her path didn't tend to live to tell the tale. We need to find Victoria Monroe, Clint said, his voice firm. She's the key to unlocking everything. If we can get her to talk, we can break the whole thing wide open. Pierce looked hesitant, but Clint could see the resolve in his eyes. He knew Clint was right. "All right," Pierce said, after a moment. "But getting to her won't be simple. She's a ghost. Every time we've tried to trace her, she disappears without a trace." Clint stood, his muscles tensing as he prepared to move. "Then we'll have to get creative." The plan was set into motion almost immediately. Clint and Pierce gathered a small team of agents, carefully selected for their experience with undercover operations. They couldn't afford to waste time. Every minute counted. And as they prepared to move, Clint couldn't shake the feeling that the net was closing in around them. They were walking into a dangerous game, one where trust was a luxury they couldn't afford. Victoria Monroe wasn't someone who could be captured by traditional means. She had too many resources at her disposal, too many connections. So Clint and Pierce had to get smarter, more subtle. They would need to use the one thing that Victoria wouldn't see coming: Clint's reputation.
The plan was simple. Clint would use his public persona to get close to her. He would infiltrate her world by playing on her ego, drawing her into a trap she would never expect. It was risky, but Clint had always believed in the power of playing the long game. "I'll need a cover," Clint said, pacing the room as the agents made their final preparations. "Something big enough to catch her attention, but not so obvious that she'll see it coming." Pierce nodded. "We've already put together a profile for you. You're not just Clint Eastwood. You're Clint Eastwood, the Hollywood mogul, the man who knows how to play both sides of the fence. You'll be the perfect bait." Clint smirked. "I've played characters more dangerous than this before." With their plan in place, Clint and the team set out for the next step in their operation. The location was a high-profile charity gala, one where Victoria Monroe was known to make an appearance. It was the perfect place to draw her in, a venue full of people, but with enough privacy to get the job done. As Clint entered the venue, the flashing lights of the paparazzi and the buzz of the crowd made him feel like he had stepped back into the world of Hollywood. But this time, the spotlight wasn't just on him for his movies. It was for something much more dangerous. He walked through the crowd, greeting familiar faces, all the while keeping an eye out for Victoria. It wasn't long before he spotted her, across the room, standing with a group of influential businesspeople. She was everything Clint had expected: confident, poised, and calculating. But there was something in her eyes, a flicker of something darker. Something that told Clint she knew exactly how to manipulate those around her. Clint made his way toward her, his steps deliberate, his demeanor calm. As he approached, he could see Victoria glance in his direction. Her eyes narrowed, as though evaluating him. The game was on. "Mr. Eastwood," she said, her voice smooth, yet with an edge that didn't go unnoticed. "I didn't expect to see you here tonight." Clint smiled, extending his hand. "I could say the same about you, Ms. Monroe. I've heard a lot about you. I've been impressed by your work." Victoria's lips curled into a small smile, but Clint could sense the calculation beneath her calm exterior. "You flatter me," she replied, "but I'm sure you didn't come here just to talk about my career."
Clint chuckled, letting the tension hang in the air for just a moment before he replied. "No, I came here because I think we can help each other. I've got a proposition I think you'll find very interesting." Victoria's eyes flickered with interest, but Clint could see the skepticism in her posture. She wasn't someone who would make a deal unless there was something in it for her. The game had officially begun. As the conversation unfolded, Clint knew that every word, every gesture had to be calculated. They were walking a fine line. If he pushed too hard, she would back off, but if he played it too cautiously, he would lose the opportunity. It was a high-stakes game, and Clint was playing for more than just information. He was playing for his life. As the night wore on, Clint could feel the walls closing in. They were close. But with Victoria Monroe, nothing was ever as simple as it seemed. The real challenge was just beginning. The following days passed in a blur of strategy and deception. Clint Eastwood knew that every moment spent lingering in the shadows was another opportunity for Victoria Monroe to slip away. They were closing in on her, but as always, nothing was as simple as it seemed. Clint had kept his distance after their first meeting at the charity gala, but every encounter with Victoria had drawn him deeper into the dangerous web she spun. At first, it was subtle, an invitation to a private dinner, a casual mention of mutual business interests, but Clint was no fool. He knew this was her way of testing him, evaluating his value, seeing if he was worth trusting, or if he would crumble under pressure. Clint wasn't about to crumble. He had lived a life full of dangerous stakes, ones that often didn't involve the simple yet lethal game of cat and mouse that he now found himself embroiled in. No, this was much more complex, more personal. He wasn't dealing with a movie villain, but someone whose power and reach went far beyond anything the silver screen could depict. The night after the gala, Clint met with Agent Pierce and the team to debrief. "She's playing a game, Pierce," Clint said, a hint of frustration in his tone. "And I'm not sure if she's trying to get me in her bed or in a box 6 feet under." Pierce gave a half smile, but his face quickly turned serious. "Both are possibilities. But let's not forget, this isn't just about Victoria Monroe. She's a cog in a much bigger machine. The goal is still Harris, and we need to use everything we have to expose his entire operation." Clint leaned forward, rubbing his temples. "Right. But we can't just go after Harris without understanding how he's tied to Monroe. We've got to find her weak spot."
"She's been in this game too long, Clint. There's no obvious weak spot with her," Pierce replied. "But there might be a way to rattle her. We've got intel suggesting she's been in contact with some high-profile individuals, some of them very dangerous." Clint nodded, the gears in his head turning. "I get it. We need leverage. Something that forces her to make a mistake, something we can use to corner her." "Exactly," Pierce said. "But we need to be careful. One wrong move and she'll disappear. And we'll be left chasing her for months, if not longer." Clint took a long breath, the weight of what was at stake pressing down on him. This wasn't just about exposing corruption or bringing down a criminal network. It was about survival. He had been thrust back into this world of shadows and deceit, and this time, there was no backing out. "I'll keep the pressure on her," Clint said, "but we need to hit her where it hurts. If she's working with people in high places, we'll need to bring those people into the light." With the plan set, Clint once again entered the world of Victoria Monroe. It was a dangerous dance, but Clint had mastered this kind of strategy in his years of covert operations. He was more than just an actor. He had been a soldier, an agent, and a strategist. He knew how to play his cards carefully. The following week, Victoria invited Clint to a secluded mansion on the outskirts of the city. The invitation came after a string of private, cryptic messages that Clint had received from her. It was an offer he couldn't refuse. But as Clint approached the mansion, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't going to be the meeting he had anticipated. When Clint arrived, Victoria was waiting by the front doors, her smile as calculated as ever. "Mr. Eastwood," she said, her voice warm but with an underlying coldness. "I'm glad you could make it. I trust you've been enjoying the city?" "I'm not here for sightseeing, Victoria," Clint replied, his tone sharp. "You've got something to tell me, and I think it's time we get to it." Her smile didn't falter, but Clint could see the faintest flicker of annoyance. "Straight to the point, I see. I like that." They walked into the grand foyer of the mansion, the expansive hall decorated with priceless art and exquisite furniture. Everything about this place screamed power, an intimidating display of wealth and control. But Clint wasn't here for the decor. He was here for answers. "I have something you want, Mr. Eastwood," Victoria said as they sat down in a plush sitting area, "and I think you'll find it quite valuable." Clint raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening." "I have information that could bring down Clayton Harris," she said, her voice lowering slightly, as if sharing a secret. "But I'm not giving it to you for free. There's a price for this kind of information."
Clint didn't flinch. He had anticipated this moment. "What's the price?" he asked, leaning forward. Victoria leaned back, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I want your help. There are certain people who are standing in my way, people in positions of power, people who think they can control me. I want you to take them out of the picture, permanently. In return, I'll give you everything you need to destroy Harris." Clint felt the weight of her words sink in. She wasn't just asking for a favor, she was offering a deal. But Clint wasn't a fool. He knew that making an alliance with Victoria Monroe could be as dangerous as making an enemy. And the price she was asking for was steep. "Let's say I agree," Clint said cautiously. "What happens next?" Victoria's lips curled into a smile. "We take down the people who've been working against me. You help me eliminate them, and I'll give you the intel you need to bring Harris to his knees." Clint stayed silent for a moment, considering his options. The plan wasn't without its risks, but Victoria had information he needed. And right now, he had no better leads. But something about the deal felt off. Clint wasn't sure if he could trust Victoria, or if she was just another player in a game where everyone had their own agenda. Still, he knew one thing: he had no choice but to play along, for now. "I'll help you," Clint said, his voice calm but resolute. "But you're not calling the shots. If I'm going down this road with you, I'm in charge of how we play this game." Victoria's eyes sparkled with a mixture of amusement and challenge. "We'll see about that, Mr. Eastwood." As they shook hands, Clint couldn't shake the feeling that he had just stepped into a far more dangerous game than he had anticipated. He wasn't just up against Harris anymore. He was up against an entire network of power, manipulation, and deadly secrets. The stakes had just gotten much higher. But Clint Eastwood had never backed down from a challenge. And this time, he wasn't about to start. The days following Clint's reluctant alliance with Victoria Monroe were a whirlwind of careful planning, tense conversations, and covert operations. Every step he took with her felt like walking a tightrope. He was fully aware that one misstep could send him plummeting into a deadly abyss. He had agreed to her terms, help her eliminate her enemies, and she would give him the leverage to bring down Clayton Harris. But Clint had always trusted his instincts, and something about Victoria didn't sit right. There was always a layer of deception beneath her perfect facade, a quality he couldn't ignore.
Despite his misgivings, Clint moved forward with the plan. The first step was to take down one of Victoria's biggest adversaries, Robert Hawke, a wealthy businessman with deep ties to government officials and criminal syndicates. Hawke was ruthless, unyielding, and far too confident in his power. Victoria had given Clint everything he needed to expose Hawke's illegal dealings, but getting close to him wouldn't be easy. He was guarded, always surrounded by a network of loyal bodyguards and security experts. Clint had faced men like Hawke before, men who thought their money and influence could protect them from anything. But Clint wasn't just a man of muscle and force. He was a man of strategy, and right now, strategy was his best weapon. The first step was simple: create an opening. Clint spent the next few days making the rounds in high society, gradually integrating himself into the circles that Robert Hawke frequented. He knew that if he could get Hawke to trust him, he would have the leverage he needed to execute his plan. It wasn't long before Clint found himself invited to one of Hawke's exclusive dinner parties. The invitation was an unexpected surprise, but Clint had been expecting it. Hawke's ego was as large as his bank account, and he didn't mind showing off to anyone who might be able to help his reputation. Clint, with his high-profile Hollywood connections and his rumored ties to various political figures, was the perfect guest for such an affair. As Clint entered the lavish mansion, he could already feel the undercurrent of tension. The guests were all well-dressed, their conversations full of hollow pleasantries and self-congratulatory remarks. It was a world Clint had never truly been part of, but one that he could navigate with ease. He had spent enough time in the spotlight to know how to play the game. He spotted Robert Hawke almost immediately, standing tall at the center of the room, a glass of wine in hand, surrounded by admirers. Clint took a moment to observe him. Hawke was a man of calculated charm, his smile a practiced weapon, his eyes cold and assessing. Clint couldn't help but wonder how many lives Hawke had ruined in the name of his empire. Clint made his way over, taking a deep breath before extending his hand. "Mr. Hawke," he said, his voice smooth, but with an edge of authority that demanded attention. "It's an honor to meet you." Hawke's eyes flickered with interest as he shook Clint's hand, his grip firm and confident. "Mr. Eastwood," he said, his voice dripping with politeness, "the pleasure is mine. I've heard quite a bit about you. Hollywood's finest, and now it seems you're branching out into business. I suppose I've always had a taste for a challenge, Clint replied with a knowing smile. And I hear you're quite the businessman. I'd love to discuss some ventures we could explore together.
Hawk's interest piqued. I'm always open to new opportunities, he said, leading Clint toward a quieter corner of the room. But tell me, Clint, what exactly are you looking for? The conversation flowed easily, as Clint had anticipated. Hawk's arrogance made him an open book, eager to show off his influence and connections. Clint didn't have to press hard, the man practically spilled his secrets. It became clear to Clint that Hawk's business dealings were far from legitimate, and his connections with criminal organizations were even more extensive than Victoria had let on. He was a man who thought he was untouchable, and that's exactly what Clint needed to exploit. But Clint wasn't here for small talk. He had a job to do, and that job involved pulling the strings that would bring Robert Hawk crashing down. Over the course of the evening, Clint continued to play his part, making sure to leave just the right impression. The goal was to get Hawk comfortable with him, to let him believe that Clint was nothing more than a businessman looking for a way into the world of elite power. As the night wore on, Clint knew that the real work would begin once the party ended. And sure enough, the evening's final act was fast approaching. As guests began to leave, Clint made his move. He casually pulled out his phone, tapping out a quick message to Pierce. Hawk's weaknesses are exposed. We move tonight. By the time the last guest had exited the mansion, Clint had already slipped into the shadows. His job was far from over. He needed to ensure that the information he had on Hawk would be leaked, enough to ruin his reputation, force his hand, and leave him vulnerable to attack. But that wasn't enough. Clint needed something else, something that would guarantee Hawk's fall. That's when he saw her, Victoria Monroe, standing alone in the hallway just outside the study. She had been watching him from the moment he entered the mansion, and now she approached, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. How did it go? She asked, her voice low, her eyes sharp. Clint didn't mince words. It went as planned. Hawk's skeletons are out of the closet. The next step is for you to take care of the rest. Victoria gave a small, satisfied smile. You've done well, Clint. But don't get too comfortable. Hawk is just one piece of the puzzle. You'll need to stay on your toes. There are more enemies to take down before this is over. Clint's gaze hardened. I didn't sign up for a never-ending game of chess, Victoria. But I'll finish what we started. As the two of them stood in the dim light of the hallway, the storm that had been brewing for weeks finally seemed to be approaching its climax. But Clint knew one thing for certain, no matter how high the stakes, no matter how dangerous the game, he wasn't backing down. The pieces were in motion, and Clint Eastwood was ready for the next move.
But what he didn't realize, what neither he nor Victoria could see, was that they were no longer the hunters. In this game, they had become the hunted, and their enemies were closing in. The night after Clint's successful infiltration of Robert Hawk's inner circle, the air felt thick with tension. Victoria had promised him information that could bring Clayton Harris down, but the price she demanded in return, helping her eliminate her enemies, was beginning to take a personal toll on Clint. The stakes had escalated, and he found himself sinking deeper into a web of power, deceit, and dangerous alliances. Clint wasn't sure whether he was helping Victoria or being manipulated by her. What started as a simple task, gathering information, had morphed into something far darker. Hawk's downfall was just the beginning. Victoria wasn't going to stop until everyone who stood in her way was removed, and Clint knew he was being pulled into a game far beyond his control. His thoughts were interrupted by a sharp knock on his hotel room door. Without a word, Clint stood from the desk where he'd been reviewing his notes on Hawk and opened the door. It was Agent Pierce, his expression serious as ever. You've made quite an impression on Hawk, Pierce said, stepping inside. I got the intel from our team. His financial records are as filthy as we expected. You've done your part well, but now we need to move fast. Things are escalating, Clint. Clint didn't waste time with pleasantries. He gestured for Pierce to sit. I know. I've been playing a dangerous game with Victoria Monroe, and I'm not sure I can trust her. But there's no turning back now. She has the information I need to take down Harris, and I can't back out without jeopardizing everything. Pierce's face remained stoic, but his eyes flashed with concern. Just make sure you don't lose yourself in this, Clint. You're getting deeper into something that could get both of us killed. Monroe's not just a player. She's a power broker. She's as dangerous as Harris, if not more. Clint rubbed his chin, thinking carefully. I know, but right now, she's my only lead. And as much as I don't like it, we've got to stick with her if we want to get to Harris. Pierce nodded, but didn't look convinced. All right, just remember who you're dealing with. The deeper you go with her, the harder it's going to be to get out. Clint didn't reply immediately. The truth in Pierce's words hung in the air, and for a brief moment, Clint considered what his next move should be. But there was no room for hesitation now. The web had already been spun, and he was tangled in it. I'll keep my eyes open, Clint said, standing up and grabbing his jacket. I need to meet with her again. If we're going to take down Hawk, I have to make sure she keeps her end of the deal. We move tonight, or we lose our shot.
Pierce hesitated, clearly unwilling to let Clint go without warning. Clint, you're walking a thin line. Don't let her pull you further into her web than you already are. Clint didn't respond to that. He already knew the danger he was in. But he also knew that he had no choice. The stakes were too high to back down now. The mansion was eerily quiet when Clint arrived at Victoria's estate. It was late, and the lights in the grand hallway gleamed like sentinels in the darkness. Clint couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into a lion's den, fully aware that once he stepped inside, he would have to play by her rules, rules that had no place for weakness. Victoria was waiting for him in the study, standing by the grand fireplace, her silhouette outlined by the flickering flames. As he entered, she turned, offering him one of her trademark smiles, calculated, cold, but undeniably captivating. I see you've come to your senses, Victoria said, her voice low and smooth. It's about time we discuss our next steps. You played your part with Hawk, but the real game begins now. Clint didn't sit. He stood by the door, his posture tense. I'm not here to play games, Victoria. You promised me information on Harris. I've done what you asked. Now it's time for you to keep your word. Victoria raised an eyebrow, the slightest hint of amusement playing on her lips. Oh, Clint, don't be so impatient. Everything in due time. You're still too focused on Harris. You should be thinking about the bigger picture. Clint's jaw tightened. The bigger picture is Harris. He's the one running the show. Everything connects back to him, and if we don't take him down, none of this matters. Victoria's gaze hardened, the warmth in her voice fading as she stepped closer. You really believe Harris is the puppet master, don't you? That's exactly what he wants you to think. Harris is a pawn in a much larger game. And while you've been busy chasing him, you've failed to see the real enemy. Clint didn't flinch, though his mind raced to process her words. Who's the real enemy, then? Victoria's eyes narrowed, and her lips curled into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Me. Clint's heart skipped a beat, and for the briefest of moments, he thought he misheard her. You? Yes, Victoria confirmed. You see, Clint, Harris is just a means to an end. I've been building an empire, one that no one can touch. And you, my dear Clint, are just another tool in my box. Clint's blood ran cold as the full weight of her words hit him. For all the time he had spent in this world of high-stakes politics and criminal enterprises, he had never anticipated this. He had been a pawn all along, used by Victoria in her own game, just as much as she had used Hawk, and just as much as she had intended to use Harris. You think you've been playing me all along? Clint asked, his voice steady, but his pulse quickening.
Victoria smiled softly, the expression laced with a touch of admiration. I don't think, Clint. I know. You see, I have my own goals, bigger than anything you can imagine. And if you're smart, you'll realize that the best thing you can do is stay by my side. Clint's mind whirled, but one thing was clear. He had underestimated her. Victoria Monroe wasn't just a dangerous player in the game. She was the game itself, a ruthless mastermind pulling strings from the shadows. Stay by your side? Clint repeated, a dark laugh escaping his lips. "You think I'm going to just fall in line and do whatever you say?" Victoria's gaze was piercing. "You don't have a choice. If you want Harris, if you want to take down everyone in your path, you'll have to choose the right side. And right now, Clint, that side is mine." Clint's hand flexed at his side, his fingers itching for the gun he kept holstered beneath his jacket. But he didn't make a move, not yet. He was still calculating. The game wasn't over, not yet, but he was beginning to understand. Victoria Monroe had her own agenda, and if he wasn't careful, he'd be swallowed whole by it. As Clint left the mansion that night, a sense of dread filled him. The walls around him seemed to close in as he processed the reality of his situation. There was no way out now, not unless he outsmarted Victoria. But was that even possible? The web was tightening, and Clint was no longer sure who was holding the threads. He had been drawn into a much darker world than he ever imagined, and escaping it would require more than just skill and cunning. It would take something much more dangerous, and Clint Eastwood was more than ready to face it. The morning after his meeting with Victoria was a blur of thoughts and emotions. Clint didn't know what to make of what had transpired. He had always believed himself to be a master of the game, an expert at reading people and situations. But Victoria Monroe? She was something entirely different. She wasn't just playing chess while he was playing checkers. She was redefining the game, turning every move into a trap, every alliance into a double-edged sword. As Clint sat in his hotel room, nursing a cup of black coffee and staring out at the city skyline, he couldn't help but feel a sense of urgency rising within him. His mission hadn't changed. He was still hunting Clayton Harris, still determined to bring down the man who had ruined so many lives, including his own. But the more he interacted with Victoria, the more he realized that she wasn't just another obstacle. She was a force in her own right, one with her own ambitions that didn't necessarily align with his.
There was a moment, back in the study, when Victoria's words had hit him with a cold, hard truth. If you want Harris, if you want to take down everyone in your path, you'll have to choose the right side. And right now, Clint, that side is mine. Clint knew what she was implying. He had to decide whether to stay in this game with her, risking his own life, his own morals, or walk away, abandoning the hunt for Harris and losing his chance at revenge once and for all. But could he really walk away? He didn't think so. His thirst for revenge, for justice, for closure, was too strong to let go of now. Harris had to pay. And if Victoria was the only way to make that happen, then so be it. But that didn't mean Clint wasn't going to play his own game. He would walk alongside Victoria for now, but he was no fool. He would keep his cards close to his chest, ready to play them when the time was right. Because in this world, trust was a currency that had no value, and Clint wasn't about to put all his chips on someone who had already shown her hand. Clint had barely finished his coffee when his phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was Pierce. "We need to talk. I've got information about Harris. Come to the safe house." Clint didn't hesitate. He grabbed his jacket, tossed his phone into his pocket, and left the room, the weight of the decision ahead pressing heavily on his chest. The safe house was a nondescript building in the outskirts of the city, away from the prying eyes of the world. When Clint arrived, Pierce was already inside, waiting by a table covered with maps and documents. The room smelled faintly of old paper and coffee, a constant reminder of the long hours they'd spent tracking Harris's movements. "What's going on?" Clint asked, his tone brisk. He was eager for information but didn't want to show too much urgency. He needed to keep his cool, especially now. Pierce handed him a manila folder and gestured to the table. "We've been following Harris's financial ties, and things are starting to line up. He's been funneling money through several shell companies, none of which have any obvious connections to him. But our sources have managed to track some of those transactions to one place, a shipping dock on the outskirts of the city." Clint's brow furrowed as he flipped through the documents. "What's at the docks?" Pierce leaned in. "A lot of dirty money, Clint. We believe it's the location of Harris's offshore accounts, a black market operation that involves everything from weapons trafficking to illegal arms deals." If we can hit that location and gather concrete evidence, it'll give us leverage we can use against him. Clint exhaled slowly. This could be the break we've been waiting for. What's the catch?
Pierce's expression darkened. The catch is that Harris knows we're onto him. He's been cleaning up his tracks and now, he's got muscle watching those docks 24/7. We'll need to move fast and carefully if we want to get in and out without alerting him. Clint's gaze hardened. We'll need backup. Pierce nodded. I'll have our team ready, but we don't have much time. Harris is unpredictable. If we don't move on this soon, we risk losing the window of opportunity. Clint stood, his mind already calculating the next steps. There was no time to waste. If he was going to make his move against Harris, he would have to be precise, swift, lethal, and ready for whatever Harris threw his way. But there was one more thing Clint needed to consider. Victoria Monroe had already shown her cards, but how would she react if he moved on Harris without her? The thought of working with her, of trusting her, made his stomach churn. But Clint wasn't in this for friendship. He was in it for the kill. I'm going in tonight, Clint said, his voice resolute. I'll take care of Harris's docks. You get the team together. We'll need to be in and out, no exceptions. Pierce didn't argue. He simply nodded, grabbing his phone to start making calls. Clint could feel the weight of the upcoming mission pressing down on him. He was about to enter the lion's den, and this time, there would be no turning back. The night was colder than Clint expected when he arrived at the shipping docks. The lights were dim, casting long shadows across the expansive area. There were cargo containers stacked high, their contents a mystery to most. To Clint, however, the entire place felt like a maze, each turn potentially leading to his death. He had come prepared, a silenced pistol at his side, a tactical knife hidden in his boot, and a team of experts waiting in the wings. This was it, the moment when everything he had worked for could finally come to fruition. But even as Clint walked toward the entrance to the docks, a nagging thought stayed with him. Was this the right move? He shook it off. The mission came first. Harris came first. As Clint slipped past the guards and into the heart of the operation, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The docks were eerily quiet. Too quiet. A shadow moved at the edge of his vision, and Clint's instincts kicked in. He dove behind a nearby shipping container just as the sound of footsteps reached his ears. The game had changed, and Clint had just stepped into a trap.
A voice crackled over his earpiece. Clint, this is Pierce. We've got movement. Harris's men are on the move. We need to get out of there, now. But Clint wasn't listening. His mind was focused entirely on the figure emerging from the darkness, a man he recognized all too well. Victoria Monroe. Clint's hand went to his gun, his heart pounding in his chest. The web had truly tightened, and now, it was clear, Victoria was playing her own game. And Clint? He was caught right in the middle of it. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Clint's heart skipped a beat as Victoria stepped out from the shadows, her presence both commanding and chilling. He had expected many things at the docks tonight, armed guards, chaos, maybe even Harris himself, but not her. Not Victoria Monroe. Her eyes locked onto his, the faintest smile tugging at the corners of her lips. There was no surprise in her gaze, no apology. She was calm, collected, and dangerously self-assured, as if she had been waiting for him all along. Surprised to see me, Clint? She asked, her voice smooth as velvet but laced with an undercurrent of amusement. I would have thought you knew by now that I always have eyes everywhere. Clint stayed crouched behind the shipping container, his hand tightening around the grip of his pistol. The sound of his breathing was steady, but inside, his mind was racing. He'd walked right into her trap, and now, he was faced with the reality, Victoria had been playing him from the start. He wasn't just a pawn in her game, he was the bait. He didn't answer her question immediately. Instead, he scanned the docks for any sign of movement. The shadows around them seemed to stretch farther, the quiet becoming suffocating. It was too late to retreat, and with the team on standby, There was no way he could get out of this situation without risking their lives too. "You've been using me, haven't you?" Clint's voice was cold, his words deliberate. "All this time, I thought I was playing you. But it turns out, I was the one being played." Victoria chuckled, as if amused by his sudden realization. She took a few steps closer, her heels clicking against the concrete as she moved with a graceful yet predatory pace. "Oh, Clint. You were never more than a useful tool in my hands. But don't mistake that for weakness. I needed you to get close to Harris, to take out his associates. Now that you've done your part, well," she trailed off, letting the unspoken threat linger in the air between them. Clint's pulse quickened, but he kept his composure. He couldn't let her see the fear or anger that threatened to surface. He had been prepared for betrayal, but not like this. Not by her. "So, what now?" Clint asked, his voice low but laced with tension. "You want me dead? Or are you just here to watch me burn?"
Victoria's eyes narrowed, her smile fading into something far darker. "You've done the hard part, Clint. You've gotten close to Harris, and you've stirred the pot. But now you're a liability. You've seen too much. You know too much. And when a man knows too much, he becomes expendable." Clint's breath hitched slightly, but he didn't move, his gaze locked on hers. "You think I'm just going to roll over and let you take me out?" Victoria tilted her head, studying him carefully. "I think you'll see that you don't have much of a choice. You've already crossed me, Clint. And in my world, that means you don't get to walk away unscathed. It's either you work for me, or you end up as another casualty." Clint's mind raced. Her words made it clear. She had always been in control. And now, she expected him to fall in line, to become another piece in her game. But Clint had never been one to simply obey orders. He had been in this world too long to let someone else dictate his fate. He stood up slowly, his hand still clutching the gun, his eyes never leaving hers. He needed to act, and fast. If he hesitated, he would lose everything. His life, his freedom, and the one thing he had left. The chance to bring down Clayton Harris. Before he could make a decision, a rustle sounded from the shadows, and Clint tensed, instinctively reaching for his gun. But it wasn't one of Harris's men. No, it was someone Clint hadn't expected. Someone he thought was still playing their part from afar. Agent Pierce emerged from the darkness, his face grim, his hand resting on the holstered gun at his side. "Clint, don't do it," Pierce said, his voice barely above a whisper, but filled with urgency. "She's been using you from the start. You can't trust her. This is a setup." Clint didn't lower his weapon, but his eyes flicked toward Pierce. The confusion was evident on his face. "What are you talking about?" Pierce stepped closer, his expression tight with tension. "Harris isn't the target, Clint. He's just a distraction. Victoria's been playing both sides this entire time. She's got connections everywhere, and she's been using you to get close to Harris while setting her own plans into motion. You've been helping her build her empire, not take it down." Victoria's lips curled into a smile, as if Pierce had just confirmed what she had been planning all along. "You see, Clint," she purred, her tone like honey but with venom beneath, "you're no longer useful to me. But Pierce here? He's got no idea how deep this rabbit hole goes. But don't worry. You'll learn soon enough." Clint's mind spun as he processed what Pierce had just said. Everything he thought he knew about this operation was a lie. The alliances, the information, the plan. It was all part of a much bigger scheme. He had been manipulated from the start.
"So, what now?" Clint asked again, his voice laced with bitterness. He knew what Victoria wanted, to control him, to make him her puppet. But Clint wasn't going to go down without a fight. Victoria took another step closer, her eyes locking onto his with a predatory gleam. "Now, you make a choice. You either work for me, or you die. The decision is yours, Clint. But know this, I always get what I want." For a brief moment, Clint considered his options. He could fight. He could try to escape. But he knew that if he tried to run, he would be running straight into her trap. Victoria had him cornered, and she wasn't about to let him walk away. His mind whirred, and then, in a flash of clarity, Clint made his decision. "Fine," he said, his voice sharp and steady. "I'll play your game. But understand this, Victoria, no one controls Clint Eastwood. Not you, not Harris, not anyone." Victoria's smile widened, her eyes glinting with satisfaction. "We'll see, won't we?" The moment the words left her mouth, Clint knew that this was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The battle for control had only just begun, and Clint was ready to fight for everything he had left. But this time, he wasn't just fighting for revenge. This time, he was fighting for his very survival. And as he exchanged a final glance with Pierce, Clint knew one thing for certain: no matter what, he wasn't going down without a fight. The game had shifted. The stakes had never been higher. And Clint Eastwood wasn't about to lose. Clint's mind raced as he stepped deeper into Victoria Monroe's web. He had agreed to her terms, partly out of necessity, partly out of sheer defiance, but there was no escaping the truth: he was now part of her game. The stakes had never been clearer, and for the first time in a long time, Clint had no idea which direction he was supposed to go. Was he really working for her now, or was he simply waiting for the perfect moment to flip the script and take control back? Victoria had given him a task, one that he wasn't sure he could complete without putting himself in even more danger. But right now, there was no choice. He was caught in the middle, surrounded by enemies on all sides, with no way out but forward.
As the night wore on, Clint found himself standing at the edge of the same dark streets he had once used as his hunting grounds. The familiar hum of city lights and distant traffic was almost comforting, but tonight it felt more like a warning. The city had always been Clint's domain, a place where he could read people, manipulate situations, and make them work to his advantage. But now, things were different. Now, there were players in the game far more dangerous than anything he had encountered before. Pierce had been silent ever since they left the docks. He had been the voice of reason up until now, but Clint could sense that even he was shaken by what had just unfolded. They were both deep in this mess, and neither of them had any idea how to escape it. But Clint couldn't afford to focus on that right now. He had to focus on the mission. The mission. The docks had been a failure, a setback that he couldn't afford. The only thing that mattered now was getting close to Harris and uncovering his true motives, before Victoria could use him as a pawn for her own agenda. Clint's phone buzzed in his pocket, interrupting his thoughts. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. It was a message from Victoria. "I need you to meet me at the warehouse in an hour. Bring Pierce. We have work to do." Clint cursed under his breath. He had no idea what Victoria was planning now, but he had no choice but to follow her lead, for now. The alternative was staying in the dark, and Clint was done with that. He needed answers. When Clint and Pierce arrived at the warehouse, the place was even more foreboding than the docks had been. A lone streetlight cast a pale, sickly glow over the entrance, and the silence was deafening. Clint had always hated places like this, isolated, empty, where danger could strike from any angle. "Stay sharp," Clint muttered to Pierce, his hand resting on the gun at his side. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he wasn't about to walk into this place unprepared. The door to the warehouse creaked open as Clint pushed it, revealing a vast, dimly lit interior. The scent of metal and oil hung in the air, a reminder of the industrial complex that had once thrived here. But now, the space felt abandoned, a shell of its former self. Shadows danced across the walls, and the only sound was the faint echo of their footsteps. Then, through the darkness, Victoria's voice cut through the silence. "You're late."
Clint and Pierce turned to find her standing by a table in the center of the room, her silhouette sharp against the dim light. Her posture was relaxed, confident. She wasn't worried. Not one bit. Clint kept his distance as he approached, Pierce right behind him. "What's this all about?" Clint asked, his tone flat. "What are we doing here?" Victoria smiled, an unsettling glint in her eye. "You wanted to take down Harris. I wanted him gone too, but we need to do this right. There's a certain finesse involved. You don't get to take down a man like him without making some powerful allies along the way." Clint's brow furrowed. So you want me to play along with your little scheme, what, to build some empire of your own? Her eyes narrowed, but the smile never left her lips. No, Clint. I don't want an empire. I want leverage. And that's exactly what you're going to help me get. You have the connections, the skills, and the dirt on Harris. Now, you're going to use all of that to take him down. But you need to do it my way, or we both end up dead. Pierce, who had been silent until now, spoke up. What's the plan, then? You've got us here. Now tell us what we're supposed to do. Victoria turned toward Pierce, her expression unreadable. I'm going to leverage your connections too, Pierce. You've got people who can help us access Harris's inner circle. We need to isolate him, break him down from the inside out. And when he's on his knees, we'll make sure he has no choice but to play by our rules. Clint's patience was wearing thin. I didn't sign up for this. I'm here to get Harris, not to help you play a long con. This isn't what I agreed to. Victoria didn't flinch at his outburst. Instead, she took a step closer, her eyes fixed on him with a cold, calculating look. You agreed to help me take Harris down, Clint. You didn't agree to anything else. You're in too deep now. There's no backing out. Not unless you want to be buried 6 feet under. Clint clenched his jaw. He didn't like the way she was playing him, but he knew she was right. He couldn't back out now. Harris had to be stopped. He glanced at Pierce, who was staring at Victoria with a mix of suspicion and unease. All right. I'm in. But don't think for a second I'm doing this for you. Victoria's lips curved into a smile. You'll do it for yourself, Clint. And you'll do it because you know you can't do it without me. We're in this together now. Whether you like it or not.
As the night dragged on, Clint found himself drawn further into Victoria's plans. The deeper they went, the harder it became to distinguish friend from foe. He had trusted people before, only to watch them turn on him. Now, here he was, stuck in the middle of a game where there were no clear lines, only shadows, deception, and dangerous alliances. The quiet hum of the city outside seemed distant now, almost irrelevant. Clint's world had narrowed to this one warehouse, this one moment in time, and the realization that every choice he made from here on out would have consequences, consequences that could cost him his life. He had entered this world seeking revenge. But now, Clint realized, revenge was no longer the goal. Surviving Victoria's web, outsmarting Harris, and keeping control of his fate, that was the real game. And Clint was ready to play. But he wasn't about to let anyone, least of all Victoria Monroe, dictate the rules. Not without a fight. The following days were a blur. Clint could feel the pressure of being caught in the tightening web that Victoria Monroe had spun. He spent his nights sleepless, replaying their conversations, analyzing every detail for any hint of weakness. Yet, every time he thought he understood her play, she shifted the game, and Clint was forced to adapt. Victoria had tasked him with infiltrating Harris's organization further, gaining the trust of his inner circle, playing the part of a loyal soldier, while secretly collecting information that would give him leverage over the powerful crime boss. At the same time, she had demanded Pierce stay in the shadows, coordinating from afar. It was a delicate dance, and Clint was starting to feel as though he were walking on a razor's edge. Every move felt calculated. Every word spoken in the company of Harris's men was weighed, measured, and scrutinized by both sides. Victoria's eyes were always on him, even when she wasn't physically present. The moment he stepped outside the boundaries of what she expected, Clint knew she'd strike without hesitation. And so, he kept his guard up, each interaction with Harris's crew becoming a game of double bluff. But the deeper Clint went into Harris's world, the more dangerous things became. The people around him, those he had once seen as nothing more than pawns, were starting to feel like real threats. They were watching him now, not just Harris, and Clint could sense their growing suspicion. It was the little things, an awkward glance, a tightened jaw, a hesitant step, that told Clint the walls were closing in. He couldn't trust anyone, not even the men who had fought beside him in the past. Every conversation, every deal, had layers of deceit beneath the surface.
That evening, after a particularly tense exchange with one of Harris's lieutenants, Clint returned to the safe house where he and Pierce had been laying low. The air felt thick with tension, the walls of their temporary refuge closing in on him. Pierce was waiting in the dimly lit living room, pacing back and forth. "You're late," Pierce said, his voice clipped. Clint didn't answer immediately. Instead, he collapsed onto the couch, his fingers instinctively reaching for the flask tucked in his jacket pocket. He took a long swig, the burn of whiskey momentarily numbing his mind. The night had been a mess, more threats, more lies, and the realization that he was getting closer to the point of no return. "I've been thinking," Clint said, his voice hoarse. "Victoria's playing a bigger game than I realized. She's not just after Harris. She's after everything. I think she's setting herself up to take over." Pierce stopped pacing, his eyes narrowing. "You think she's using you for more than just Harris?" "That's not surprising, Clint. I've been telling you from the start, she's got her own agenda. But you're too deep now. You can't just pull out without putting yourself in even more danger." Clint rubbed his temples, exhaustion weighing heavily on him. "I know. But it's not just that. It's the trust. I don't trust her, but I'm beginning to think I don't trust anyone. I've been in this game long enough to know that betrayal is always around the corner." Pierce took a seat across from him, his eyes dark with concern. "You're not wrong. But you've got a choice to make. You can keep playing Victoria's game, or you can try to turn the tables on her. But be careful, Clint. You're walking a fine line." Clint exhaled slowly, his mind whirling. He had to make a decision soon. Every move he made could push him further into Victoria's grasp or give him the leverage to escape. He didn't have the luxury of time anymore, and if he didn't act quickly, he would lose everything. "I'm going to get Harris," Clint muttered, his voice low with determination. "But I'm not going to do it the way Victoria wants. I'll use her to get close, but I'll be the one who finishes it." Pierce didn't respond right away, but Clint could tell he was weighing his words carefully. Finally, he spoke, his voice a mix of caution and resolve. "You know what you're up against. If you go after Harris on your own, you're not just crossing Victoria. You're crossing everyone who's got a stake in this. But I'm with you, Clint. I'll back you, no matter what." Clint gave a small, grim smile. "I appreciate that, Pierce. But I can't let you take the fall with me. This has to be my fight." The room fell into an uneasy silence. Clint knew that this was the moment when things would either fall into place or spiral out of control. There was no turning back now. The plan was set, and all he had to do was execute it.
The following day, Clint met with Harris, under the guise of furthering their mutual interests. As always, the room was tense, the air thick with unspoken threats. Clint had learned over the past weeks how to navigate these meetings, how to keep his cool even when Harris's men circled like vultures, waiting for any sign of weakness. Harris, for his part, seemed amused by Clint's presence. He saw Clint as a tool, someone to use until he was no longer needed. But that arrogance was Harris's weakness, and Clint intended to exploit it. "I'm glad you're here, Clint," Harris said, his voice smooth as silk, but with an edge of danger. "I'm starting to think you might be the right man for the job. You've proven yourself resourceful." Clint's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I do what needs to be done." Harris leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "I'm sure you do, but I need more from you. You're in a unique position, Clint. You have access to the people I need, the ones who control the city. If you help me consolidate my power, I'll make sure you're rewarded. Riches, power, anything you want." Clint kept his expression neutral. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The opportunity to collect information, to learn what Harris truly wanted. But he had to tread carefully. He couldn't reveal his hand too soon. "I've already given you enough," Clint replied, his voice steady. "I've done what you've asked, Harris, but there's something I need in return. I want your trust. I want to be your right-hand man. I want to be the one who makes the real decisions." Harris's lips twitched into a smile, but Clint saw the wariness in his eyes. Harris wasn't used to giving up control, and he certainly wasn't about to hand it over to Clint. You want more? You'll have to prove yourself, Clint, Harris said, his tone turning colder. But we'll see. You've got the ambition. I'll give you that. Keep your eyes open. The game is changing. Clint left the meeting with a renewed sense of purpose. He was in deeper than ever, but now he had Harris's attention. But with each step he took, Clint felt the weight of the choice he had made. Victoria's influence was still looming large, and he knew that if he wasn't careful, he could become another pawn in her game. The web was tightening, and Clint had to stay ahead of the trap. Clint sat alone in his apartment that night, the dim light from the street lamp outside casting long shadows across the room. His mind churned with the latest developments. Harris had extended an offer, but Clint knew it wasn't out of trust. It was a test, a way to see how far Clint could be pushed before he cracked. But it wasn't the test that bothered him. It was the looming question of what came next.
Victoria was watching. He could feel it, even when she wasn't physically there. The weight of her gaze was a constant pressure on him, always lurking in the back of his mind. She was too shrewd, too calculating for him to trust completely. But he had to admit, she had a knack for getting what she wanted, and Clint wasn't sure if he was still playing her game, or if she was playing his. The whiskey in his hand tasted bitter as he swirled it around. The burn was sharp, but it didn't numb the unease gnawing at him. It was becoming clearer every day that this wasn't just about Harris. This was about control. Victoria wasn't after Harris's empire, she wanted to carve out her own. And Clint was stuck in the middle, forced to play both sides while trying to figure out how to come out on top. A knock on the door broke the silence. Clint's hand instinctively went to the gun at his side. He wasn't expecting anyone, especially not tonight. He stood slowly, keeping low, and peered through the peephole. His heart skipped a beat when he saw the figure standing outside. Pierce. Clint opened the door, his face a mask of suspicion. What's this about? Pierce didn't waste time with pleasantries. We need to talk. Clint stepped aside, letting Pierce into the apartment. The moment the door closed behind them, Pierce spoke again, his voice tight. Something's off. I've been following the leads you've been gathering, and I've got a bad feeling. Victoria's not playing this the way we thought she was. Clint's pulse quickened. What do you mean? Pierce took a deep breath, running a hand through his hair. I've been digging, Clint. I've got contacts I trust, and they're telling me something's wrong with the way she's moving. It's not just Harris she's after. She's been consolidating power in the shadows, getting rid of anyone who might get in her way. Clint's mind raced. He had suspected as much, but hearing it from Pierce made it feel too real. So what's the play? Do we confront her? No, Pierce said, shaking his head. If we do that, we're playing right into her hands. She's always one step ahead. I think we need to stop worrying about her and focus on Harris. We need to hit him where it hurts, take away his power before he realizes what we're doing. Clint narrowed his eyes. And how do you propose we do that? Pierce glanced around the apartment, ensuring they weren't being watched, before he spoke again, his voice lower now. There's a shipment coming in tomorrow night. A big one. It's Harris's biggest deal in months, and it's being guarded by some of his most trusted men. If we hit that shipment, we cripple his operations. We take away his leverage, and we take away his allies.
Clint considered this. It was a risky move, but it was the kind of bold action that could shake things up and buy them some breathing room. It could give him a way to push Harris into making a mistake. And a mistake from Harris meant a crack in his armor, a crack Clint could exploit. But there was still the matter of Victoria. She had her own eyes on Harris's empire, and Clint wasn't foolish enough to think she'd just stand by while he went after the same prize. He had to move quickly, but also cautiously. I'm in, Clint said finally, his voice steady, despite the storm of thoughts swirling in his mind. We hit the shipment, but we do it our way, not hers. Pierce nodded, a grim expression on his face. We move fast. I'll handle the logistics, but you need to be ready. Once we pull this off, there's no turning back. Harris won't forgive us, and neither will Victoria. The next night, Clint and Pierce made their way to the docks, the cold air biting at their skin as they neared the location of the shipment. Clint's senses were on high alert. The docks were quiet now, too quiet. The only sound was the faint splash of water against the concrete and the occasional creak of the old shipping crates. They weren't alone. Clint could make out the faint figures of guards posted along the perimeter, their eyes scanning the darkness. But they weren't expecting trouble, not yet. Clint and Pierce had studied the layout of the dock for days, memorizing the guards' patrol patterns, the placement of the shipment, and the fastest escape routes. They had every angle covered. Clint adjusted the collar of his jacket, his mind running through the plan one more time. He didn't like surprises, but he knew that in this line of work, you had to be prepared for the unexpected. "I'll take the west side," Clint whispered, his voice low. "You cover the east. Let's get in and out without drawing too much attention." Pierce nodded, his face set in determination. "Got it. Let's do this." The two men split up, their movements swift and silent as they crept toward their positions. Clint's heart raced as he neared the loading dock where the shipment was being prepared. His hand hovered near the gun at his side, ready to act at the first sign of trouble. He'd done jobs like this before, simple heists, quick hits, but this was different. This wasn't just about the money or the cargo. It was about sending a message. As Clint moved into position, he spotted the men guarding the shipment. There were 5 of them, all armed, but none of them looked particularly alert. They were busy talking amongst themselves, their attention elsewhere. Clint knew this was his moment.
He signaled Pierce, who had already positioned himself on the opposite side of the dock. Pierce gave a quick nod, confirming that he was ready. Clint moved swiftly, taking down the first guard with a silent takedown. The man didn't even have time to react before Clint had him subdued, his body falling to the ground with a quiet thud. He dragged the guard's body into the shadows, making sure no one would find it until it was too late. One by one, Clint took down the other guards, his actions precise and methodical. Each movement was calculated, each decision measured. This wasn't just about taking out Harris's men, it was about proving that Clint Eastwood wasn't someone who could be controlled. Finally, Clint reached the final guard. The man was standing near the shipment, staring at the horizon, unaware of Clint's presence. With a swift movement, Clint closed the distance between them, pulling the man into a chokehold and rendering him unconscious. The dock was silent once more. Clint stood over the shipment, his breath steady, his body tense with adrenaline. It was done. They had hit the shipment hard and fast. Harris wouldn't know what hit him. But there was still one problem. Victoria. Clint's mind raced as he realized something he hadn't fully considered before. By hitting this shipment, they had just made a powerful enemy, and it wasn't just Harris. Victoria would want answers, and she wouldn't hesitate to come after them if she thought they were undermining her. They were no longer just in the game. They were in the eye of the storm. And the storm was about to hit. Clint's pulse thudded in his ears as he and Pierce made their way back through the shadows, weaving through the labyrinth of crates and shipping containers on the docks. The plan had worked, so far. The guards were down, the shipment was destroyed, and Harris's operation had been dealt a significant blow. But the sense of victory was fleeting. In the back of Clint's mind, there was only one question that gnawed at him: what was Victoria's next move? As Clint and Pierce emerged from the shadows and into the alleyway, the crisp night air seemed to sharpen the tension that had been building. They walked in silence, each man processing the gravity of what they had just done. Pierce was the first to break the silence. "Do you think we've gone too far?" Pierce's voice was low, filled with uncertainty. "This changes everything. Harris will retaliate, but I'm more concerned about Victoria. She won't like this."
Clint didn't respond right away. His mind was still on the job, running through the details one last time. He knew there was no turning back now. But that didn't mean he was ready to deal with the consequences of his actions, especially when it came to Victoria. If they had underestimated her once before, they wouldn't get another chance to make the same mistake. "We made our move," Clint finally said, his voice steady but filled with an undercurrent of tension. Now we wait. As they continued walking, Clint couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The world felt different now, like the ground had shifted beneath their feet. They weren't just players in a game anymore. They had changed the rules. And when you change the rules, the stakes go up. The next day brought the storm Clint had been expecting. He was sitting in a dimly lit diner, his fingers wrapped around a hot cup of coffee, when his phone buzzed on the table. Clint glanced at the screen, his stomach sinking as he saw the caller ID. It was Victoria. He had been waiting for this call, knowing it was only a matter of time. The fact that she was calling now meant one thing. She knew what had happened at the docks. The question was, how much did she know? Clint took a deep breath, steadying himself before answering. Victoria, he said, keeping his voice neutral. Clint, came her voice, smooth but laced with an edge. I'm glad I caught you. Did you? Clint leaned back in the booth, trying to keep his tone casual. I'm just having a quiet breakfast. What's up? There was a pause on the other end, a tension that Clint could practically feel through the phone. Then she spoke again, her voice colder. I know what you did last night. I hope it was worth it. Clint didn't flinch. I'm not sure what you're talking about, he said, keeping his tone nonchalant. Just a little business, like you asked. Oh, Clint, she said, the sarcasm dripping from her words. You think I don't know what's going on? You hit Harris's shipment, and you didn't bother to inform me first? How careless of you. I'm the one who put you in position, and now you're going behind my back, thinking you can control the game. Clint's mind raced. He had known this was coming, but he didn't have time to think about his next move. He had to stay calm, keep the conversation going, and buy himself time to figure out what to do next. If he admitted to it now, she would have all the power. If he denied it, she would only grow suspicious.
I didn't think I needed to report every little thing to you, Victoria, Clint said, his voice steady, almost mocking. You wanted me to take Harris down, right? That's what I'm doing. I'm making moves. There was a moment of silence, and Clint could feel her seething on the other end. He could practically see her eyes narrowing, her mind calculating her next move. Finally, she spoke again, her voice colder than before. You've made a dangerous mistake, Clint. But it's not too late for you to make it right. You're still useful to me. Come by my place tonight. We'll discuss how you can fix this. Clint didn't like the sound of that. I'm not in the mood for a lecture, Victoria. If you want to talk, we can talk. But I don't take orders from you. Victoria's laugh was sharp, almost mocking. You think you have a choice in this? You've crossed a line, Clint. I gave you the power to act, but that doesn't mean you can do whatever you please. You will come to me tonight, and we will fix this, together. Clint's grip tightened on his phone. He had no intention of showing up on her terms, but he also couldn't afford to make an enemy of her right now. Not after everything they had been through. I'll be there, he said, finally giving in. But don't think this means I'm under your thumb. I'll see you tonight, Clint, she said, her voice like ice. Don't disappoint me. The line went dead, and Clint sat there for a moment, staring at his phone. Pierce was right, Victoria was never going to be easy to handle. But Clint had to admit something to himself. He was starting to play a different game now. A game where he wasn't just her pawn. A game where he controlled his own fate. That evening, Clint made his way to Victoria's mansion. The streets were eerily quiet, the usual noise of the city muted by the looming tension hanging in the air. He wasn't sure what to expect when he arrived, but he was certain it wouldn't be an easy conversation. Victoria's mansion was as imposing as ever, a stark contrast to the warmth and comfort he once found in its walls. Now, everything felt cold, calculated. The mansion was a reflection of Victoria herself, beautiful, but dangerous. He rang the doorbell, and a few moments later, the heavy door swung open. Victoria stood there, her eyes narrowing as she took him in. Clint, she said, her voice almost amused. I was starting to wonder if you'd come. I hope you're ready to explain yourself. Clint stepped into the foyer, his jaw clenched. Let's get this over with.
Victoria led him to a sitting room, the air heavy with the tension between them. Clint could feel the weight of her gaze as she took a seat across from him, her eyes never leaving his face. For a moment, they just stared at each other, the silence thick with unspoken words. Finally, Victoria broke the silence. You thought you could take matters into your own hands, Clint. You thought you could change the game, but you've only made things more complicated. Clint leaned forward, his voice steady. I don't need your permission to do what I think is right. I did what needed to be done. Victoria's smile was thin, almost cruel. What needed to be done? You've got a lot to learn, Clint. You don't just get to make decisions and hope they work out. This isn't a game of chance. You're playing with people who don't forgive mistakes. Clint felt the weight of her words, but he wasn't about to back down. Not now. I don't care who you've aligned yourself with, Victoria, Clint said, his voice low. I'll finish what I started. And if you try to stop me, well, you'll learn that I'm not the one who needs to be worried. The tension in the room thickened, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Clint could feel the storm closing in around them. But now, more than ever, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let anyone control him. Not Victoria. Not Harris. Not anyone. The game was on, and Clint Eastwood wasn't about to lose. The next few days passed in a blur of uncertainty, tension hanging in the air like the calm before a storm. Clint couldn't shake the feeling that he was being pulled in multiple directions, caught between Victoria's manipulative grip and Harris's thirst for power. Both of them had their claws in him, and both wanted something he wasn't sure he could give. The uneasy peace he'd struck with Victoria didn't last long. Every time their paths crossed, there was an unspoken challenge, a power struggle just beneath the surface of their words. It was a dance neither of them was willing to let go of, each one trying to outwit the other. But Clint knew that sooner or later, one of them was going to make a move that would shift the balance of power in this dangerous game. Clint was sitting alone in his apartment late one evening when his phone buzzed again. He glanced at the screen and saw a text from Pierce. We need to talk. I think things are about to get ugly. Clint's stomach tightened. Pierce wasn't one for theatrics. If he was worried, it meant trouble was brewing. Clint immediately dialed Pierce's number.
Clint, Pierce's voice crackled through the line. Listen, we've got a problem. I've been following some of Harris's men. They've been making moves, more than I expected. Something's not right. We need to act fast. Clint leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. What do you mean, not right? There's something else going on. Harris has been meeting with people I've never seen before. They're all over the place, and I've got a feeling he's preparing for something big. Something we're not ready for. Clint let out a low sigh. How big? Pierce's voice dropped to a whisper. I think he's planning a full-scale retaliation. He's not just coming after us. He's coming after everyone who's ever crossed him. We need to decide right now if we're going to fight back or wait for him to make the first move. Clint ran a hand through his hair, trying to make sense of the information. It seemed like the walls were closing in on him. Victoria had already made her intentions clear, and now Harris was gearing up for war. Let's move. We need to get ahead of him, Clint said, his voice firm. That night, Clint and Pierce met in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. The air smelled of rust and dust, the kind of place where you could do business in the shadows, away from prying eyes. Clint wasn't sure who else had been invited, but he knew the time for subtlety had passed. They were about to plunge into the heart of a dangerous game, and there was no turning back. Pierce was waiting for him when he arrived, along with a few of their trusted associates. They sat at a long table, a map of the city spread out in front of them. It was quiet, too quiet, as though the weight of the moment had yet to settle on everyone. We need to know exactly what we're up against, Clint said, breaking the silence. What's Harris planning? Pierce leaned forward, pointing to various locations on the map. These are the places I've seen his people congregating. They're all connected to his business empire, warehouses, distribution centers, backdoor deals. He's fortifying his position, which means he's expecting us to make a move. But there's one location I'm concerned about. I think he's planning something big there. Clint studied the map, his eyes narrowing as he traced the lines Pierce had marked. The location Pierce pointed to was a large shipping yard on the outskirts of town, one that Clint knew well. It was a key part of Harris's operation, and if they hit it, they could disrupt his entire supply chain. This is it, Clint said, determination settling in his chest. If we strike here, we take out his lifeline. It'll cripple his operations.
Pierce nodded, his face grim. But it won't be easy. Harris has already doubled the security around that place. If we want to make this work, we need to hit it fast and hard. We're not the only ones watching it. Clint knew exactly what that meant. Victoria. She's going to try to take this from us, Clint said, the words hanging in the air. I'm sure of it, Pierce replied. But we can't wait for her. If we do, we'll be stuck playing her game. We need to strike first. The next few hours were a blur of preparation. They moved quickly, gathering intel, coordinating their team, and securing equipment. Clint could feel the adrenaline building as the plan took shape. This wasn't just another job. This was war. As night fell, Clint and his team drove in silence toward the shipping yard. The streets were eerily empty, the city seeming to hold its breath in anticipation. Clint's mind was focused, every detail of the plan playing out in his head. But the closer they got to their target, the more his instincts told him something was wrong. The usual buzz of activity in the area was strangely absent. No guards patrolling the perimeter. No trucks moving in and out. It was too quiet. Pierce's voice crackled through the radio. Clint, something's off. I don't like this. It feels like they're expecting us. Clint didn't need to hear more. He knew exactly what was happening. The feeling of dread settled deep in his gut. This is a trap, he muttered to himself. Before he could give the order to turn around, the sound of engines filled the air, growing louder and closer. Clint's heart raced as a convoy of black SUVs pulled into view, their headlights cutting through the darkness. They knew we were coming, Clint said, his voice low. Stay sharp. Get ready for anything. But just as he spoke, the world exploded into chaos. The first shot rang out, followed by a barrage of gunfire. Clint dove behind cover, his mind racing as he tried to process the ambush. Harris's men were everywhere, moving quickly, closing in from all sides. It was clear now, this wasn't just about Harris anymore. This was a war between him, Victoria, and Clint, each one determined to emerge victorious. And Clint, caught in the middle, had no choice but to fight. The storm had arrived, and there was no escaping it. Clint's body was alive with adrenaline as he fought back, his shots precise, his movements calculated. There was no room for mistakes now. He had to survive and take down as many of Harris's men as he could.
But even as he fired back, Clint couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. He wasn't sure if he could win this fight, or if he was playing right into the hands of one of the people he was trying to outwit. In the distance, he spotted a familiar face, a shadow moving swiftly through the chaos. It was Victoria. She was here. And with her, the game had just changed. Clint's heart pounded in his chest as he ducked behind a shipping container, his breath coming in sharp bursts. The sounds of gunfire were deafening, and the air was thick with smoke and the stench of burnt rubber. For a split second, everything seemed to freeze, the chaos around him, the bullets flying, the screaming of his men. In that moment, Clint's focus zeroed in on the one figure who had just entered the scene. Victoria. She was standing at the far side of the yard, her silhouette framed by the glow of the headlights from the SUVs. The soft click of her heels against the concrete was the only sound that cut through the madness. Clint could see the calm in her eyes, the same calculated look that had always haunted him. She wasn't rattled by the gunfire. No, she was enjoying this. Clint's mind raced, trying to figure out how Victoria had managed to arrive at exactly the right moment. He had assumed they were fighting Harris's men, but Victoria's presence confirmed his worst fear. This was never about just Harris. Victoria had been playing him all along. Pierce's voice came through the comms, sharp with panic. Clint, we're getting overwhelmed here. We need to fall back. There's too many of them. Clint didn't respond right away. His mind was consumed with the image of Victoria, poised and composed in the middle of the chaos. She was a snake in the grass, always slithering in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He knew he couldn't afford to fall into her trap. Not now. Not after everything they had been through. Clint took a deep breath, his mind snapping back into focus. He needed to get out of this mess, needed to find a way to turn the tables. Fall back, Clint said, his voice steady. We regroup. Get to the secondary location.
He didn't have to say it twice. His men were already moving, trying to find cover and retreat from the ambush. Clint's gaze remained locked on Victoria, but there was no time to confront her now. Not while they were still being shot at. He had to survive this, and that meant taking the fight to a place where he could control the outcome. The convoy of black SUVs had surrounded the perimeter of the yard, their engines roaring as they positioned themselves for the kill. Victoria's men were closing in, their faces obscured by masks, but their eyes. Clint knew those eyes. They were the same cold, ruthless eyes that Victoria herself possessed. This was no ordinary battle. This was personal. Clint was moving quickly now, weaving through the shadows of the yard with his team, the adrenaline coursing through his veins. But no matter how fast he moved, he couldn't shake the feeling that Victoria was always one step ahead. He had to get out. He had to keep moving. As he rounded a corner, he was met by a familiar face, a man he had worked with on countless jobs. He wasn't sure if this was a friend or an enemy, but there was no time for hesitation. The man's gun was raised, and Clint reacted instinctively, knocking the weapon aside before delivering a quick punch to his gut. The man crumpled, gasping for breath, and Clint moved on without another thought. They were so close to getting out of the yard, but there was one thing Clint couldn't shake. The knowledge that Victoria was watching, calculating her next move, waiting for him to slip up. Pierce's voice crackled through the earpiece again. Clint, we've got a problem. Victoria's men are tracking us. They know our backup route. We won't make it out if we keep running. Clint cursed under his breath. If they couldn't get to the secondary location, they would be exposed. Trapped. The game had shifted, and the stakes had never been higher. He glanced around, quickly evaluating his surroundings. There was only one way out, one way to turn the tide. It would be risky, but it was their best shot. Pierce, Clint said, we're not running anymore. It's time to go on the offensive. With a plan forming in his mind, Clint signaled to his men, rallying them for one last push. He knew they had to take control of the situation, or they wouldn't make it out alive. They were going to hit Victoria's convoy directly. Clint's men moved swiftly, splitting into teams to flank the SUVs from both sides. The element of surprise was their only advantage now. The chaos of the ambush had given them the perfect cover, and they were going to use it.
Clint's pulse raced as he sprinted toward the nearest black SUV, his gun raised. In the split second before he reached it, he saw Victoria again, this time, her face no longer calm, but focused, eyes locked onto him. It was a stare down. Two predators circling each other. Clint felt the heat of the moment in his chest. He knew that no matter what happened next, nothing would ever be the same between them. With a final surge of energy, Clint dove into the fray, unloading shots at the SUVs, taking out their tires and disabling their engines. His men were right behind him, fighting back with everything they had. The battle raged on for what felt like hours, but Clint knew it was only a matter of minutes before they were overwhelmed. The convoy's backup was coming in fast. He had to finish this, had to make sure that no matter what happened, Victoria wouldn't win this round. Through the gunfire and explosions, Clint's eyes locked with Victoria's once again. This time, there was no smug superiority in her gaze, just pure, unrelenting fury. She was dangerous, but Clint had come to learn that her greatest weapon was her ability to manipulate the people around her. She didn't care about winning or losing. She only cared about control. But Clint wasn't about to let her control him anymore. A loud crash echoed across the yard as one of the SUVs exploded, sending debris flying in all directions. Clint's heart skipped a beat as he saw the blast, but there was no time to check on his men. The explosion had done the job. It had created the opening they needed. "Move!" Clint shouted. He sprinted toward the remaining SUVs, his gun at the ready, his instincts taking over. His men were already charging in, securing their escape route. But Victoria, she was nowhere to be seen. Clint's eyes searched the battlefield, but there was no sign of her. Had she slipped away? Or was she waiting for him, lying in wait for the perfect moment to strike? But there was no time for that now. He had to finish this, before the chaos closed in on him. With a final burst of energy, Clint and his team pushed through the remaining forces. Harris's men were scattered, retreating under the pressure, and soon, the yard fell silent. The smell of smoke and gunpowder hung in the air, a bitter reminder of what had just gone down. As Clint wiped the sweat from his brow, his heart still pounding, he allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. They had won. But just barely. He turned to look at Pierce, who was standing nearby, surveying the aftermath. "We made it," Clint said, his voice low. "But Victoria, she's still out there."
Pierce nodded grimly. "And she won't stop. Not now. She's going to come after us harder than ever." Clint stared into the distance, the weight of the next battle already pressing down on him. The storm had passed, for now, but Clint knew this was only the beginning. Victoria had played him, but he wasn't about to let her win. Not this time. The battle was over, but the war was far from finished, and Clint Eastwood was ready for whatever came next. The days following the ambush felt like a fragile calm, a momentary pause in a storm that Clint knew was far from over. His team had regrouped, and they were all still in one piece, but the price of survival had left its mark on them. The scars weren't just physical. The emotional toll of the conflict was starting to show. Clint sat in his apartment, staring out at the city skyline. The faint glow of the streetlights below seemed so distant, a stark contrast to the chaos he had just survived. His mind kept circling back to one thing: Victoria. She had slipped away from the ambush, vanishing into the shadows, just as she always did. The quiet gnawed at him. He knew she was out there, somewhere, plotting her next move. He had hoped for a brief respite, a chance to breathe, but deep down, he knew that hope was futile. This was far from over. The phone on his desk buzzed, breaking his concentration. Clint grabbed it quickly, not bothering to check the ID before answering. "Clint," Pierce's voice came through, a rare note of urgency in his tone. "You need to hear this." Clint's brows furrowed. "What's going on?" "I just got word. Harris isn't the only one gunning for us now. Victoria's made her move. She's aligned herself with someone even bigger." Clint's heart sank. He had expected Harris to be the biggest threat right now, but this new revelation threw everything into chaos. "Who?" Clint demanded. Pierce hesitated for a moment. Then the words came out in a rush: "Victor Durand." Clint stiffened. The name hit him like a punch to the gut. Victor Durand was a name whispered in the darkest corners of the criminal underworld. Known for his ruthlessness, his ability to manipulate entire governments, and his vast network of international connections, Durand was someone you didn't cross, let alone partner with. "Why? What does she think she's doing?" Clint muttered, pacing the room.
"I don't know, Clint. But I've been tracking some of his movements. He's already made a few moves in the city. And now, Victoria's right in the middle of it," Pierce continued. "This could be bad, real bad." Clint leaned against the wall, trying to steady his breathing. Durand's reach was global, his empire vast. If Victoria was involved with him, it meant they were no longer dealing with a local war for control. They were up against an entire international network. "We can't let her win this," Clint said firmly, the weight of the situation sinking in. "We need to find out exactly what they're planning and stop them before they move." Pierce's voice was grim. "I agree. We need to be smart about this. Victoria's not the only one who plays this game." The next few days were a blur of frantic planning, tracking, and strategizing. Clint and Pierce worked together, bringing in the rest of their team to help track down any leads that might give them a glimpse of Victoria and Durand's next move. The pressure was mounting. Clint could feel it in his bones. He was fighting not just for survival, but for control of a war that had escalated to an unimaginable scale. The city had become a war zone in the shadows, with every corner hiding potential enemies. Clint found himself more and more isolated, cut off from everything familiar as he dove deeper into the murky waters of this new alliance between Victoria and Durand. Late one night, after a particularly exhausting round of meetings, Clint stood by the window of his apartment, staring at the distant glow of the skyline. His mind was still buzzing with all the information, but there was one thought that refused to leave him. What did Victoria want? He had always known she was ambitious, willing to do whatever it took to seize power. But teaming up with Durand? That was next level. It wasn't just about money or control anymore. There had to be something more. Something bigger that Clint wasn't seeing yet. Just as he was about to turn away from the window, his phone buzzed again, breaking the silence. Clint, Pierce's voice crackled urgently, "We've got a lead. I need you at the warehouse by the docks. Now." Clint's pulse quickened. A lead. Finally. He didn't ask questions. Grabbing his jacket and his gun, he headed out into the night, his mind racing with possibilities. This could be it. This could be the break they needed. When Clint arrived at the warehouse by the docks, he was greeted by the familiar faces of his team. They were tense, their eyes scanning the area, but Clint could tell they were anxious. They had been through hell already, and they all knew it wasn't over yet.
Pierce met him at the entrance, his face grim. "We got word that Victoria's men are meeting with Durand's associates tonight. We've got to get in and out without anyone knowing we're here." Clint nodded, his mind working quickly. The docks were a strategic location, the kind of place where deals were made under the cover of darkness. But getting to them without being seen wasn't going to be easy. "We move fast," Clint said, his voice steady, "and we don't leave anyone behind." The team moved like shadows, silently making their way toward the warehouse. The quiet was unnerving, and Clint couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking right into a trap. The deeper they went into the compound, the more his instinct screamed at him to turn back. But there was no turning back now. They reached the door of the warehouse, and Clint motioned for everyone to take their positions. He was about to move forward when Pierce grabbed his arm. "Clint," Pierce whispered. "Something's wrong. The air's thick with tension. I've got a bad feeling about this." Clint didn't answer. Instead, he pushed the door open slowly, his gun raised. Inside, the dim light revealed figures standing in the shadows, some of them Victoria's men, others Clint didn't recognize. There, in the center of the room, stood Victoria. But this time, she wasn't alone. Standing beside her, his cold eyes gleaming with malice, was Victor Durand. Clint's heart sank. The full scale of what he was up against hit him like a ton of bricks. Victoria turned to him, a cold smile crossing her lips. "Well, Clint," she said, her voice smooth, almost too calm. "It seems we've reached an interesting crossroads, haven't we?" Durand stepped forward, his presence like a heavy weight in the room. "I think we have, Mr. Eastwood, and I think you'll soon realize you're outmatched." Clint's grip tightened on his weapon. He wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not when everything had led to this moment. "I'm not done yet," Clint said, his voice hard with resolve. "You can't control everything, Victoria." Her smile only grew wider, and for a brief second, Clint thought he saw a flicker of something else in her eyes, a sense of finality, as if she knew something he didn't. "Don't be so sure," Victoria said softly, her voice carrying a deadly edge. "The game has only just begun."
As she spoke, Durand gave a subtle nod. Suddenly, the door behind Clint slammed shut, and the sound of footsteps echoed from every corner of the room. Clint was no longer just fighting for his life. Now, he was fighting for his freedom, and the chance to take down the empire they had built. But as the shadows closed in around him, Clint couldn't help but wonder if he had just walked into the trap of a lifetime. The door slamming shut echoed in Clint's ears like a death knell. His heart raced as he surveyed the room. The walls were lined with metal crates and barrels, shadows hanging thick in every corner. He could feel the weight of the trap closing in, the walls pressing tighter with each passing second. Victoria's smile never wavered, her eyes as cold as ice. And next to her, Victor Durand stood like a statue, still, silent, but radiating an air of ruthless power. Clint's mind raced as he assessed his options. He had known this day would come. He had known they would make a move eventually, but the timing was never something he could have predicted. There was no way out through the door. Not with Durand's men posted at every possible exit. No, Clint was trapped. And worse, he could feel the weight of their plan, whatever it was, pressing down on him like a vice. Don't bother looking for an escape, Durand's voice cut through the tension, low and steady. You're exactly where we want you, Clint. Clint's grip tightened on his weapon, but he didn't fire. Not yet. He needed to buy himself some time. Victoria, he said, his voice sharp and calm, despite the blood pounding in his ears. This is your idea of a negotiation? You and Durand thought this was going to be some kind of power move? She tilted her head slightly, still wearing that infuriating smile. You're a perceptive man, Clint. I didn't think you'd be so predictable. This isn't a power move. It's a change in the game. Victoria's eyes gleamed as she stepped closer, moving with a fluidity that made Clint's skin crawl. You see, Durand and I are on the same page. We want more than control. We want power. True power. And we know what it takes to get there. Clint's pulse quickened. He knew there was something bigger behind this, something deeper than just money or territory. He had seen it before, the hunger for absolute power. But how far was Victoria willing to go?
Durand's low chuckle broke his train of thought, and Clint's focus shifted back to him. The man's presence was overwhelming, the kind of force that made it clear he had already won. Clint didn't even need to ask what had changed. The question was, how had Victoria gotten wrapped up in this? You're here because you think you can stop us, Durand said, his voice deep and almost mocking. But you're out of your league now, Clint. This isn't a game of street hustlers anymore. This is global. Clint's eyes narrowed. Global. That word stuck with him, echoing in his head. Victoria wasn't just playing local politics anymore. She was in it for something much bigger. You think you can control everything, don't you? Clint said, his voice growing harder, more defiant. But you're wrong. There's always someone more dangerous. Always. Victoria laughed softly. I'm well aware, Clint. That's the beauty of this. There's always a bigger fish. But sometimes, you have to become the biggest fish to survive. Clint clenched his jaw. So this isn't just about the city. You're in with Durand for the whole world, aren't you? Exactly, Victoria said, her voice almost a whisper. Why settle for controlling a city when you can control countries? Why fight for a small piece of land when you can control entire economies? This is our chance to rewrite the rules. Clint's mind raced as the weight of her words hit him. She wasn't just a criminal mastermind anymore. She was trying to shape the entire global landscape. And she was willing to use Durand's empire to do it. But there was something he hadn't heard yet, something that still didn't add up. What's your endgame, Victoria? Clint asked. You want control, sure. But what are you willing to sacrifice to get it? Her smile faltered for just a second. And in that brief moment, Clint saw something he hadn't expected. It wasn't ambition in her eyes anymore. It was something darker. A willingness to destroy everything in her path to get what she wanted. That's where you're wrong, Clint, she said, stepping closer. I'm not here to destroy. I'm here to build. Before Clint could respond, Durand's men moved forward, taking their positions around the room. The air felt thick with tension, but Clint didn't flinch. He kept his gaze locked on Victoria and Durand, his mind calculating his next move. You think this ends with you controlling the world? Clint said, his voice firm. You've made a grave mistake.
Victoria's smile returned, but it wasn't a friendly smile. I think the mistake was yours, Clint. You underestimated us. A sudden rush of movement caught Clint off guard. He barely had time to react as one of Durand's men lunged at him, knocking the gun from his hand. Clint's instincts kicked in, and he quickly grappled with the man, throwing him across the room with a force that made the man crash into a nearby crate. But the fight had only just begun. Clint spun around just in time to see another figure step forward, Pierce, his face covered in a mask, his gun aimed directly at Clint. Clint's heart stopped. Pierce? Pierce's eyes were unreadable as he lowered his gun. Sorry, Clint, he said coldly. But it looks like I've made my choice. Clint's mind raced, trying to process the betrayal. Pierce had always been loyal, a trusted ally. So what the hell was going on? Don't look so surprised, Victoria's voice rang out. He's been with us for a while now. A smart man always knows when to switch sides. Clint's blood boiled as he looked from Pierce to Durand, then back to Victoria. He had no idea how long Pierce had been playing this game, but it didn't matter now. The betrayal was clear. You've made a deal with him? Clint's voice was low, filled with disbelief. Pierce didn't respond. He didn't have to. The cold look in his eyes said it all. Durand stepped forward, his smile grim. It's not personal, Clint. It's business. You've outlived your usefulness. Clint's mind was racing, but there was no time to think. The walls were closing in, and he was surrounded on all sides. He could feel the weight of his weapon slipping from his fingers, the odds stacked against him. But Clint Eastwood wasn't a man who gave up. Not now. Not ever. Without another word, Clint moved. He was outnumbered, but that wouldn't stop him. He fought his way through the men who surrounded him, the sounds of gunfire echoing in the warehouse as he made a break for it. The fight had only just begun. And no matter what, Clint was determined to finish it. As Clint sprinted toward the exit, dodging bullets and trying to outsmart Victoria's men, he couldn't shake the thought that had been gnawing at him ever since he'd walked into this room. Pierce's betrayal had shattered his trust, but it was also a wake-up call. The game had changed, and now, Clint had to fight like never before.
The clock was ticking, and the storm was far from over. Clint's heart pounded as he dashed for the warehouse door, his mind working in overdrive. The moment he'd seen Pierce's cold expression, he knew that everything had changed. Pierce, the one man Clint had trusted above all others, had turned against him. That sting of betrayal was sharper than any physical blow he'd ever taken, but Clint couldn't afford to dwell on it. Not now. His life was on the line. Gunfire rang out from behind him, and Clint ducked instinctively, weaving between crates and barrels. The echoes of the shots were deafening in the confined space, but Clint's focus remained razor-sharp. He needed to get out of here, get back to his team, and figure out how to turn the tables on Victoria and Durand. The warehouse was massive, and the layout was chaotic. It was the perfect place for an ambush. Shadows at every corner, high rafters that concealed snipers, and exits that could easily be cut off. Clint had done his fair share of operations in places like this, but tonight, he was the target. He heard footsteps behind him, echoing in the hallways. Someone was getting closer. Clint glanced over his shoulder. It was one of Durand's men, heavy-set, slow-moving, but carrying a rifle that Clint knew could take him down in an instant. Without hesitation, Clint rolled behind a stack of crates, his mind calculating his next move. He couldn't afford to make a sound. If he did, he'd be dead before he even reached the exit. Clint listened as the footsteps grew louder. He needed to time this perfectly. The man was almost upon him. He couldn't make a run for the door. It was too far. He needed to catch the guy off guard, take him down quietly. The moment the heavy-set man passed by his hiding spot, Clint exploded from behind the crates, grabbing the rifle from the man's hands and twisting it out of his grip. In one fluid motion, Clint knocked the man out cold, sending him crumpling to the floor with a sickening thud. Breathing heavily, Clint grabbed the rifle and checked the magazine. Fully loaded. It wasn't his preferred weapon, but it would do for now. He moved quickly, his footsteps silent as he continued through the warehouse, every sense heightened. His mind kept returning to the betrayal by Pierce. It was still hard to process, but Clint had learned long ago that personal feelings didn't matter in situations like this. Only survival mattered. Clint knew that the moment he left the warehouse, he would be exposed. But there was no time to waste. He had to get to his team. They needed to regroup, and he needed a plan to take down Victoria and Durand before they could execute whatever twisted scheme they were concocting.
The streets outside the warehouse were dark, eerily quiet. Clint paused for a moment, scanning his surroundings. No sign of a tail, yet. The city was like a labyrinth at night, but Clint knew these streets better than anyone. He wasn't afraid of being followed. The question now was whether he could trust anyone. As he moved through the shadows, Clint thought back to the moment when he realized Pierce was the traitor. There had been no warning, no sign that Pierce had been compromised. He'd always been the rock of their team, the one Clint relied on when everything else seemed to fall apart. But now that trust was gone, replaced by a gnawing emptiness. Clint had been blindsided, and that was a mistake he couldn't afford to make again. Clint's thoughts were interrupted by the sudden ringing of his phone. It was an unfamiliar number, but Clint didn't hesitate. He answered quickly, his hand gripping the phone as though it might slip away. "Clint, it's Pierce," came the voice on the other end. "I don't have much time. You need to listen." Clint froze, his jaw tightening. He wasn't sure if he wanted to hear what Pierce had to say. The betrayal was still too fresh, the anger too raw. But there was no way around it. If he wanted to get to the bottom of this, he had to hear Pierce out. "I'm listening," Clint replied coolly, keeping his voice steady, despite the storm of emotions inside. "I didn't want you to find out this way," Pierce continued, his voice low, almost regretful. "But you have to know, the situation's worse than you think. Victoria and Durand, they're planning something big. Something that could change everything. You can't stop them alone." Clint clenched his teeth, keeping his anger in check. "Then why the hell did you betray me?" "I didn't have a choice," Pierce shot back, his voice almost pleading. "Durand's men are everywhere. He's got a hold on everything. I didn't have the power to fight back. But now, I can help you. I can get you the intel you need." Clint was silent for a moment, the weight of Pierce's words sinking in. He didn't know if he could trust him, but the promise of inside information was too valuable to ignore. "How do I know you're not lying?" Clint asked, his voice low and dangerous. Pierce hesitated before responding. "I can give you the location of their headquarters. I know where they're hiding. The plan they're executing, it's bigger than we thought. If we don't stop them now, it's over." Clint's mind raced. This was the break he needed. The intel could be the key to bringing Durand and Victoria down. But Clint also knew better than to rush in blindly. He needed to confirm Pierce's story, needed to make sure it was real, before he acted.
"I'll meet you," Clint said finally, his voice cold. "But don't think for a second that I trust you. You've got one chance, Pierce. Don't screw it up." The hours that followed were a blur. Clint met up with his team, bringing them up to speed on the information Pierce had given him. His mind was still reeling from the betrayal, but there was no time to process it. The mission was bigger now, and the stakes were higher than ever. They moved swiftly, piecing together the intel, preparing for the confrontation that was sure to come. But Clint knew they weren't just up against a criminal empire anymore. They were fighting a battle for control of a global power shift. And no matter how much betrayal and corruption they encountered along the way, Clint was ready to finish it. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for something more. As Clint and his team made their final preparations, the weight of what lay ahead began to settle in. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into the belly of the beast, and this time, there might be no coming out. But there was one thing Clint knew for sure. He wasn't going down without a fight. And Victoria and Durand wouldn't know what hit them. Clint stood at the edge of the rooftop, staring down at the city below. It was late, too late for anyone to be awake. But Clint had always been a man of the night, a man who thrived in the shadows. The city that had once been his playground now felt like a cage, its streets twisting beneath him like a maze. But he wasn't afraid anymore. Tonight, everything changed. Clint's team was ready. They had spent hours gathering intelligence, tracing Durand's movements, mapping out every hidden door and every escape route. Pierce had come through, at least for now. The location was confirmed, and it wasn't just some hideout. It was a fortress. a place where Durand and Victoria had orchestrated their global plot, and it was there that Clint would make his stand. The wind bit at his skin, but Clint barely noticed. His mind was elsewhere. He replayed every moment since his confrontation with Victoria in the warehouse. The betrayal by Pierce, the hunt for answers. Every second had led to this, and he wasn't walking into this fight blindly. This time, he was prepared. Clint glanced over his shoulder, where his team stood, waiting. They were his family now, men and women who had stood by him in the darkest of times. They had seen the worst, and they had come back stronger. Together, they could take down Durand and Victoria. Together, they could stop the madness from spreading any further. Clint, one of his men, Tom, spoke up from the shadows. His voice was steady, calm. "We're ready. We've got eyes on every exit. We take them out, and we finish this."
Clint nodded but didn't speak. His mind was still sharp, but the gravity of the situation wasn't lost on him. Tonight, they weren't just fighting for control. They were fighting for the future, for the world that would be shaped by the outcome of this war. Clint had no illusions. If they failed tonight, Durand and Victoria would reshape the world in their image. And it wouldn't be a world anyone could survive in. "I'm not going to let them win," Clint said finally, his voice low. His words carried the weight of everything he had been through, the betrayals, the fights, the loss. "We do this by the book. Stick to the plan. No mistakes." Tom nodded, understanding the gravity in Clint's tone. There was no room for error tonight. As they made their way through the darkened streets toward the headquarters, Clint's thoughts drifted briefly to Pierce. The man had seemed sincere on the phone, offering information that could lead to Durand's downfall. But Clint couldn't shake the feeling that Pierce was still playing both sides. His motivations were unclear, and trust was something Clint couldn't afford in this game. At the gates of the compound, Clint's team set up silently, taking their positions with military precision. The compound stood before them, a fortress of steel and stone, surrounded by guards who had no idea what was coming. Clint had one goal in mind: reach Durand. End this. They moved swiftly, eliminating any guards who got in their way. Each man fell with a quick, clean strike, never seeing Clint or his team coming. They had trained for this. They had prepared for every contingency. But Clint's mind was focused on the one thing that mattered now: getting to Victoria and Durand. Inside the compound, the silence was deafening. The air felt heavy with the promise of destruction. Clint led his team through the hallways, navigating the maze of corridors with ease. It was a labyrinth, but they had memorized the layout, down to the smallest detail. They reached the central chamber, the heart of the operation, where Clint knew they would find Durand and Victoria. The door was heavy, reinforced, and guarded. But Clint wasn't about to let anything stop him now. "Get ready," Clint whispered to his team, signaling for them to take their positions. With a swift motion, Clint kicked the door open. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Durand stood by a large map on the wall, studying it intently, while Victoria sat in a chair, her back to them, her eyes flicking up as they entered. The surprise in their eyes was short-lived. Well, Durand said, his voice dripping with amusement. "I knew you'd show up, Clint. You can't resist a good fight, can you?" Clint's jaw tightened. "This ends tonight, Durand."
Victoria stood, her eyes narrowing as she sized Clint up. "You should have stayed out of it, Clint," she said coldly. "You were a good pawn, but you've outlived your usefulness." Clint didn't flinch. "You've been using people your whole life, Victoria. It's time someone put an end to it." Durand stepped forward, his smile predatory. "You're too late. The plan is already in motion. You can't stop what's already been set in motion." Clint's eyes flashed with fury. "Don't bet on it." Without warning, Clint moved first. He fired a shot, hitting one of Durand's men who had been trying to flank them. The gunfire echoed through the room, and the remaining guards scrambled into position. It was chaos. The sound of gunfire, the sharp tang of fear, the smell of sweat and gunpowder. Clint fought with everything he had, his every movement fueled by the knowledge that the future of the world hung in the balance. His team worked in perfect sync, taking down Duran's men one by one. But the real battle was just beginning. Clint's eyes locked on Victoria as she reached for a weapon. She was fast, but Clint was faster. He grabbed her wrist before she could get a shot off, twisting it and slamming her to the ground. "Not so fast," he growled. "You're done." Victoria glared at him, a dangerous smile tugging at her lips. "You think this is over? You think you've won?" Clint's grip tightened. "It's over, Victoria." Just then, Durand lunged at Clint, catching him off guard. The two men collided in a furious struggle, the power behind Durand's blows almost overwhelming. But Clint fought back with everything he had, fueled by rage and determination. Finally, with a final, desperate move, Clint broke free, using Durand's own weight against him. He slammed Durand into the ground, knocking the air from his lungs. "Don't mess with me," Clint growled, breathing heavily. As Clint stood over the defeated Durand, his body aching from the fight, he realized that it was finally over. Victoria and Durand had been brought down, but the victory felt hollow. The battle had been won, but the scars, both physical and emotional, would remain.
His team gathered around him, their faces grim but relieved. They had survived. But Clint knew this was just the beginning. There would be more battles to fight, more enemies to face. The world didn't stop turning just because a few villains had been taken down. But for now, Clint could breathe. For the first time in a long time, he had a moment of peace. And he knew that he would continue the fight. Because that's who Clint Eastwood was. He never gave up. Not ever. As Clint walked away from the wreckage of the compound, he looked out over the city, the skyline bathed in the light of the rising sun. The world had changed, but Clint was ready to face whatever came next. Because Clint Eastwood had one rule: always survive. The dust had settled. The gunfire, the screams, and the chaos had all faded into a distant memory. Now, as Clint stood alone on the rooftop of the now-defunct compound, he could only hear the wind whipping through the air, a sharp contrast to the thunderous noise that had filled the space just hours ago. The sun was rising, casting its golden glow over the city, but Clint couldn't shake the weight on his chest. Victory had been won, but the cost had been steep. The team had cleared the compound, arrested the remaining members of Durand's network, and secured all vital intelligence. Durand and Victoria were now prisoners, but Clint knew better than to think it was truly over. Power like theirs, the webs they wove, didn't just vanish overnight. There would be others, new players waiting to take their places, but that was the reality Clint lived in. He had learned long ago that the battle never truly ended. It was just a cycle. You could win, you could take down the biggest players, but there would always be another storm waiting on the horizon. The sound of footsteps behind him broke Clint's concentration. He turned slightly, not needing to look to know it was Tom, his right hand, the man who had been with him through thick and thin. "Is it over?" Tom asked, his voice tentative. He had always been the more cautious of the group, the one to remind Clint of the bigger picture when emotions ran high. Clint sighed deeply, shaking his head. "No, Tom. It's never really over. Not in this world." Tom nodded, as though he expected nothing less. They both knew the score. But for now, they had made their stand, and they had come out on top. That in itself was something worth celebrating, even if Clint wasn't in the mood for it. "What now?" Tom asked, his brow furrowing slightly. There was a lot of uncertainty in his voice, but also a glimmer of hope.
Clint leaned against the ledge, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. He thought about his team, his family. He thought about the betrayal he'd endured, the friends he'd lost, and the enemies he'd faced. It was a hard life, but one he had chosen, one he couldn't escape. For a moment, Clint didn't say anything. He just breathed, letting the cool morning air fill his lungs. Then, finally, he spoke. "Now, we rebuild. We fix what's broken, and we make sure this never happens again." Tom glanced up at him, a question still lingering in his eyes. Clint didn't need to say more. They both knew it wasn't just about taking down Durand and Victoria. It was about ensuring that there were no more shadows lurking in the corners. It was about making sure that the world stayed safe, one operation at a time. But first, Clint added with a slight smile, we take a damn break. Tom chuckled softly, shaking his head. That sounds like a good idea. Clint's team began to regroup around him, their faces tired but filled with quiet satisfaction. They had all fought hard to get here, and now they had the chance to rest. There would be time for reflection, time to process the events of the past few days, but for now, Clint could afford to savor the moment. Later that day, Clint sat at a small cafe just outside the city, a steaming cup of coffee in his hand. It was an ordinary moment, something he hadn't experienced in a long time. The hustle and bustle of the city moved on around him, oblivious to the war that had just been waged and won just a few miles away. For a moment, Clint let himself breathe. The road ahead would be difficult, there was no doubt about that. But for the first time in what felt like forever, Clint allowed himself to feel something other than anger and pain. He felt a quiet sense of peace, a fragile peace, but peace nonetheless. The betrayal by Pierce still stung, but Clint had learned to move on from those who betrayed him. It was painful, but it was part of the job. What mattered now was his team, the family he had forged through countless battles, and the world they were trying to protect. As the day wore on, Clint's thoughts turned to the bigger picture. The intelligence they had seized from Duran's operation had exposed a network of corruption that ran deep, and they would need to address it. But there was something else, a chance to rebuild, to reshape the world into something better, something worth fighting for. It wasn't going to be easy, and Clint knew it wouldn't happen overnight. But this was the opportunity they'd been waiting for.
The team was already planning their next moves, and Clint would be right there with them, as always. There was no turning back. He was a part of something much larger than himself now, something bigger than just survival or revenge. This was about building a future. He couldn't deny it, there was a glimmer of hope in his heart. It wasn't much, but it was enough. As Clint finished his coffee and stood up to leave, he couldn't help but glance back at the bustling street. Life was moving on, but for him, everything had changed. It was a strange feeling, one he hadn't felt in a long time, the feeling that maybe, just maybe, there was light at the end of the tunnel. He stepped into the car waiting for him, his team already inside, ready to face whatever came next. The road ahead was uncertain, but Clint was used to uncertainty. After all, uncertainty was just another name for opportunity. And Clint Eastwood wasn't the type of man who backed down from opportunity. As the car drove off into the horizon, Clint looked out the window, his eyes steely with resolve. He had learned a lot on this journey, the value of trust, the cost of betrayal, and the importance of never losing hope. And above all, he had learned that no matter how many battles he fought, there was always another one waiting. But Clint was ready. He always had been. And as long as he was standing, the fight would never stop. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?